kinige go gegi no one mentioned one that gay no we know magazot get nimnige go grana we do kage me jim on then just gang go gegi no we know dog going kinams way. Well, good morning to chiefs and to the candidates that are participating and dialoguing this morning with each other here. We thank Sally for opening up in a good way. It's always nice to hear our elders open all our meetings up in a good way. Today's meetings will provide a platform for the candidates in this year's provincial election to address First Nations leadership and to share their platforms. It's also a chance for the First Nations leadership to share their experiences and ask questions to raise priority issues affecting their communities. I encourage to all engage in dialogue with each party leader joining today's meeting and share your stories, challenges, and solutions. The priorities discussed today will help build strong, resilient First Nation communities in Ontario. First Nation priorities are Ontario's priorities. It is time for us, both First Nations and the government of Ontario, to chart a new path to embrace effective, self-determined solutions. And I know, Chiefs, we do have solutions that we want to share with everyone. I ask that the Chiefs get first priority to ask questions. And if a Chief would like one of their technicians to ask the question in their place, that they first introduce the technicians. So again, miigwech to all our candidates, and the first one that we have here, I want to welcome you to our First Nation leadership in Ontario. That are about we are 133 strong in Ontario, so we do have a strong voice, and we want to be part, not just be part, we are part of Ontario. So with that, I want to say miigwech, and let's have an awesome dialogue back and forth with our leadership. Miigwech.
Thank you, Chief. Just a couple of ground rules in terms of how we will proceed. We do have each of the leaders joining us from the Green Party, the New Democratic Party, the Liberal Party. Unfortunately, I think Mr. Ford sends his regrets from the Conservative Party. So we'll go with the time that we have. We have till about 5 to 10, try to transition, go to the next speaker in terms of we have 3 invited guests with us. I ask that we use the hand up function in terms of putting our questions to the candidates. We do, or the leaders, the reactions button, and it's the bottom one with the hand up function. The other ones stay up for a few moments, then they disappear. I really only have one basic rule when we're having these conversations, that respect yourself, take care of yourself, be here, be present, be willing to participate, and also respecting each other. What I like to do really in the sessions, if you're going to ask a question, if possible, to turn on your camera. I always say that with COVID, it's been awfully lonely. It's nice to see faces. So do bring up the camera if you can. We also, just a couple of items, and you'll notice I combed my hair this morning. It's because we're live streaming on YouTube. We have www.youtube.com/Chiefs of Ontario. So your members and citizens across the country can join us on YouTube and watch this live. So, and you'll see the link is also in your chat, so you can forward that to anyone within the communities out there to join us for our conversation. Also, the www.chiefsmeeting.com is for additional information that you might have. I believe that's my basic rules. I'll just be a traffic cop. I'm hoping that all the chiefs are ready to engage, have their questions ready to go for each of our leadership, or each of the candidates who are running for on June 4th. I understand everyone's filling up their candidates' writings and getting all ready to go. So without further ado, let's jump right into our conversation. Welcome Mr. Schreiner, who is the leader of the Ontario Green Party, or the Green Party of Ontario. En français, ça. Parti vert de l'Ontario. So welcome, Mr. Schreiner, to our conversation. The floor is all yours. And usually I'll have like 15 minutes for yourself, and then we'll open up the floor for the candidates, and then we'll go to around 10-2, or 5-2. Welcome, Mr. Schreiner. The floor is all yours. Oh, so Mr. Schreiner, we can't hear you yet for some reason. And I just want to let everyone know that we are recording it and we're all live on YouTube. So I'm hoping we can hear Mr. Schreiner. Maybe give us a test microphone. Is anyone else not hearing him? I'm not hearing him.
No, I'm not hearing him either.
Okay.
Mr. Schreiner, your secondary account is muted. Are you using the other account for audio? That might be it.
Oh,
Can you hear me now?
there you are. There you go. Welcome, Mr. Schreiner. I can hear you now.
Okay. Yeah, sorry about that. I don't know. We must have been having some technical issues. So Chimigwich, and thank you so much for inviting me to join you. It's an honor to be able to share this time with you. And I just want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Toronto, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and the Treaty 13 lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And I just want to say that, I don't think land acknowledgement should be a box to check. I think it's an opportunity to commit to the truth and reconciliation process, the nation-to-nation relationships, and to really create and build a new legacy for our relationships. And there's no denying it. We have been through a pretty challenging and turbulent time, especially over the last 2 years. The pandemic has really turned our lives upside down, forced businesses to close roads and sidewalks and schools, and revealed the deep cracks in our systems of care, especially for the most vulnerable in our province. The housing affordability and cost of living crisis is hurting families and communities. And the fact is that the climate crisis is here, and many worry about what is going to come next. The trauma and real pain of finding lost children at residential institutions, the very real impact all of this is having on people's mental health and well-being. And the reality is that COVID-19 hit many Indigenous communities disproportionately hard. And we know that pre-existing inequalities meant worse outcomes and larger burdens to shoulder for communities and caregivers. And so the pandemic has really laid bare the cracks in the foundation of our province, from healthcare to jobs to housing. And it's laid bare once again how systemic racism and the legacy of colonialism and broken promises have very real consequences for today. So I believe there's a lot of work ahead of us if we want to create a future that is fair, just, and caring. There's no time for half measures or election gimmicks that will only paper over the cracks. Our problems need new solutions, and the time for meaningful action towards reconciliation is now. We cannot afford to wait. As leader of Ontario's Green Party, I commit to upholding Indigenous rights to self-determination and to act with respect for treaty obligations. Together, let's create a new legacy. Let's create a new legacy for Ontario's economy, one that upholds the rights of full participation, consent, and partnership with First Nations and treaty rights holders across Ontario. And this starts by working in partnership with First Nations that includes participation and respect, nation to nation. And it also includes implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in Ontario. There's no doubt that we're facing a climate crisis, and we need action now. We cannot afford to wait. Indigenous communities have paid the price for bad environmental policies of this province. The crisis in Grassy Narrows is but one example. It's shameful that after 40 years, the communities are still dealing with the effects of mercury poisoning. We believe that environmental justice is part of reconciliation. The province must set stricter standards for air and water pollution in areas such as Aamjiwnaang First Nation, which is surrounded by chemical industry factories. I know we can do better as a province. We can act now to ensure the right protections and enforcement is in place to protect our environment and people's health. And you know, some might call these laws red tape. I call them protecting people in the places we love. So together, let's take on the generational challenge of the climate emergency and act now to embrace opportunities in the new climate economy, opportunities that can benefit everyone. But to do this, to have Ontario be successful in the green transition, this requires a relationship between First Nations in the province that starts with the provinces upholding its legal duty to consult, where the province respects treaty rights and ensures that there is free, informed, and prior consent. The opportunities in the new climate economy can benefit everyone, but only if First Nations rights are upheld. We cannot heal our relationship with Mother Nature if we don't heal our relationship with each other. Projects like building transmissions lines, as one example, will be needed to electrify our province. These projects can create job and economic opportunities and benefits, as well as address the climate challenge, but only if the province upheld the Indigenous rights to self-determination. The province must fully collaborate with Indigenous peoples on decisions around placement, ownership, benefits, development, and operation of any project on Indigenous lands. We know that natural spaces are critical to addressing climate change, to clean our air and water, improve mental and physical health, keep cities and communities cooler, and reduce flooding and fire risk. Our plan calls for permanent protection of 25% of Ontario land by 2025 and 30% by 2030. And to help us get there, we propose that the province make a $1 billion commitment to investing in Indigenous climate leadership. Indigenous-led investments, including Indigenous protected and conservation areas, things like community renewable energy projects, and other priorities for Indigenous communities. And to recognize and support this, we need to amend the Mining Act to comply with UNDRIP and to respect no mining zones set by First Nations, so that protected areas as declared by First Nations have priority over extractive industries. But we also know there are huge opportunities for an electric vehicle manufacturing supply chain in this province, and that we can access critical minerals and metals in a more sustainable, circular way, and with respectful recognition and co-ownership with Indigenous climate leaders. Creating a dedicated Ministry of Indigenous Affairs separate from MNR will be a vital first step in accomplishing this and ensuring that we move forward in a way with strong protections for water, land, and air quality. We also know that the housing crisis has profound impacts on people's quality of life. Everyone should have the right to a safe and affordable place to call home. But in Ontario, we have a housing affordability crisis. And we also know that the ongoing negative legacy of colonialism is that Indigenous people in Ontario are more likely to face core housing needs. 1 in 5 single detached homes in First Nations communities need to be replaced, and many more are in need of better repair. Indigenous peoples on and off reserve have a clear legal right to local control of programs. And that's why the Ontario Greens support government funding for an urban and rural Indigenous-led housing strategy that is Indigenous owned and operated. We've committed a funding investment of 22,000 permanent Indigenous-led homes. That's part of our plan to build 60,000 or 160,000 affordable housing spaces in Ontario over the next decade. We know that housing is so much more than a roof over our heads. Good housing is essential for our health. and is at the center of our communities and the places we love. I'd also like to take a moment to talk about mental health care in Ontario. For too long, governments in Ontario have treated mental health as an afterthought, not as a need to have. But I want to be clear, mental health is health. And we, the Ontario Greens, would expand OHIP to include regulated mental health professionals so that everyone can have access to affordable, accessible, and comprehensive mental health services. We are committed to working with the federal government to identify and close the gap in health outcomes between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. And we know that it is critical that the expansion of mental health care services for Indigenous communities be Indigenous-led. Our mental health plan includes proposals to invest in Indigenous-led health centers and healing programs for mental health, increase the number of Indigenous professionals working in healthcare at all levels, particularly in Indigenous communities, provide properly funded Indigenous-led supports for survivors of residential school trauma, and improve the availability of services and supports in Indigenous languages. I'd like to also take a moment to acknowledge the horrific past of Canada's residential school system and to recognize that that tragic legacy persists today. I mourn the lives of the children that were lost and the families whose lives were destroyed by the residential school system throughout the decades. And I honor the healing journey of the survivors and their families and commit to ongoing active process of reconciliation and of confronting the truth. I support the calls of the Chiefs of Ontario for provincial information support and full funding for residential school investigations and for community-led research, funding for mental health resources, and needs-based funding to ensure culturally appropriate reparations for remains. We need a full, nonpartisan commitment to tackling systemic racism and the legacy of colonialism that perpetuates in our society today as we confront the truth and as we work towards reconciliation. So I want to conclude by saying thank you for the opportunity to be with you this morning. I look forward to the opportunity to have ongoing conversations, respectful dialogue, and a commitment to action. And I look forward to the conversation we're going to have this morning. Miigwech, thank you.
Mr. Schreiner, I already see some hands going up, so we do have the hand up function for questions. You can also use the chat function if you wish, if you don't want to ask the question live on YouTube, but I can do that on your behalf. I see Chief Mishano, question.
Oro, thank you for attending here this morning. Before I ask you a few questions, I'd just like to make a statement here in regards to the Conservative government of Ontario and Doug Ford's absence. I'm not surprised that they're not here. The Conservative government has been absent as far as First Nations have been concerned for the last year and a half and maybe even 2 years. So they've been absent, so I'm not surprised they're not here today. I think that was an excuse, the medical reason. Anyways, that's my in my rant for the morning, and hopefully the Ford government will wake up. But anyways, my question for you and the Green Party is, would you support and advocate for the separation of the ENDM and IAO, those two ministries, which basically are in conflict with each other? Rickford holds both of those portfolios, and advocating on behalf of First Nations and ENDM at the same time is a conflict. So what would you do to advocate and try to separate those two ministries? Another question I have is in regards to Indigenous parks. You mentioned a little bit about it, but one of the things that Big Tagang Anishinaabe have been trying to do through their Aboriginal title land claim is to create Indigenous parks. But at both the federal level and the provincial level, there's no legislation to do that. You'd have to work within the provincial, existing provincial legislation. There's no ability to do that. So there needs to be separate legislation created so that we can create Indigenous parks to protect areas that we want to protect, not that someone else wants to protect. And my last comment is in regards to the mental health. You're correct. We need more attention being put towards the mental health system, and I'm glad you mentioned that because the mental health system in Ontario is broken. It's been broken since Mike Harris, another conservative government, started dismantling ministries and dismantling programs way back in his day. So there's nothing now. There's a disconnect between physical health and mental health, and those things need to be worked out together. Miigwech, thanks for listening.
Thank you, Chief. Go ahead, Mr. Schreiner.
Yeah, Miigwech, Chief Machado, and yeah, maybe I should have enunciated it clear in my remarks, but absolutely support a standalone ministry with clear ministerial responsibilities and budget line items for Minister of Indigenous Affairs. I'll be frank, I'm a big supporter of the opportunities that exist in the new climate economy and the mining opportunities that exist. But I think you're right, it's a conflict of interest to have the Ministry of M&R and Northern Resources in the same minister with Indigenous Affairs. I think they need to absolutely be separate, and we need to make sure that those types of decisions, particularly when it comes to mining, are done with free, informed, prior consent of Indigenous peoples. Absolutely support legislation to establish Indigenous parks and Indigenous-led parks. I mean, we know the first and best stewards of this land that we now call Ontario have been Indigenous peoples, and having Indigenous-led protected areas with proper funding. And that's why we've costed out a platform commitment of $1 billion for Indigenous-led climate solutions. And then finally on mental health is health, and we have to start treating it as health. I mean, you know, if you went to hospital with a broken arm and somebody told you that, you know, you'd have to come back in 10 months to get care, and to access that care, you'd probably have to pay for it out of pocket. That would just be completely unacceptable. And so why do we allow that to happen for mental health? So that's exactly why the Ontario Greens have costed and are fully committed to making mental health services available through OHIP, so that people have access to the mental health services they need in the community they live in, that they can afford. And also a commitment to ensuring that we have Indigenous mental health practitioners, and then we recognize the important role that healing ceremonies and other land-based healing efforts, just how important they are. And so, you know, I very much want to work with the chiefs in making these commitments a reality in the next Ontario Parliament.
Thank you, Mr. Schreiner. Chief McLeod.
Anin, Mike, good to see you again.
Likewise.
Anin Kinawea, Zongabwe Dijnakas, Bizing Dunjaba, Chief McLeod, Nipissing First Nation. So I have, question. Like I know pretty much your position on a lot of the green energy, and obviously that's a main part of your party's platform. But my thoughts or my concerns go to some of the issues that aren't necessarily obvious with the Green Party, and that's we all know Canada's history, and there would be no Canada without the treaties. The treaties form the foundation for Canada, and we also know that there would be no Ontario if there was no Canada, and obviously that's because of the treaties. So my concern and question is around traditional lands, sometimes referred to as treaty lands. I consider them traditional lands first. The treaty came after, but then the province calls it crown land, which is really not accurate. So knowing the history and how things came to be, my concerns are how the province constantly unilaterally makes decisions and on use and occupation as if it's their land, as if the treaty never existed. And we see that constantly. We're as First Nations, we see our traditional lands getting smaller and smaller because of this assumption of jurisdiction over those lands, which we never gave title to Canada, never mind Ontario. I think we look to receive more than just consultation in that, we are, these are our lands, and we expect to be at the table making decisions on those lands. We constantly see the province giving legitimacy to Métis and other groups in our traditional lands that were historically never there. In some cases, giving them more legitimacy to a point where our communities are getting legislated out of existence through the Indian Act, but theirs, are being entrenched by provincial policy and legislation. So, my question is, how does the Green Party view that the importance of treaties, the importance of underlying title to those lands and decision making, and also the jurisdiction of creating and legitimizing these interest groups without consultation of First Nations, without us. I mean, we gave Ontario legitimacy, and now Ontario is giving other groups legitimacy in our territories. And I just want to get a sense as to what your opinion is and what your view is on those issues.
Yeah, so Chief McLeod, thank you for that question. And I've really appreciated the opportunities that we've had to have meaningful conversations around these issues, particularly around traditional lands and treaty rights. And Ontario is a signatory to treaties and are bound to those treaties, and we have to uphold them. And that's why I deeply believe that we need free, informed, and prior consent for development approvals. The issue around Métis rights, I mean, I appreciate what the Chiefs of Ontario have said in saying, hey, we recognize the important history of Métis peoples and their rights, but it can't be done through the watering down or violation of First Nations rights. And so, that's why First Nations need to be at the table as full partner participants in those conversations and those decisions. I think one of the things that we need to grapple with, and I'm no legal expert, I won't pretend to be, is respecting Indigenous law as part of the way in which we move forward. And I'll give you one example of that. I worked with Rod Whitelow at Six Nations in moving forward some amendments that would require Indigenous consent to water taking permits. And even trying to write those amendments with the legal drafters at Queen's Park was very challenging because of just the lack of, I think, proper recognition of Indigenous law in particular. And I persist and persevered and was able to move some amendments. Unfortunately, they were voted down. But I thought it was important to start. It was important to have that conversation and those efforts on the record at Queen's Park. And I'm deeply concerned, particularly when it comes to mining in the north, and I think it's particularly the northwest of the Ring of Fire. Huge opportunities there for Ontario and for First Nations, and it has to be done right. And so I find, some comments of, hey, I'll hop on a bulldozer and drive up there and start digging myself, just completely inappropriate and really doesn't fully, shows a lack of understanding of traditional lands and treaty rights. And so that's why I hopefully made it very clear in my remarks that we need to apply UNDRIP to the Mining Act, and we need to ensure that there's free informed prior consent before development happens, and that I think we need to have Indigenous ownership be part of that, because the economic benefits need to benefit all communities. And so very much eager to work with the chiefs on those issues.
Schreiner, Chief Miracle.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Mr. Schreiner, for joining the Chiefs this morning. And my best wishes are extended to everybody on the call from Mohawks to the Bay of Quinte. I heard part of your presentation. I was tied up with another matter this morning, but I did hear you mention the housing crisis that currently is ongoing. I'd like to know, what is your understanding of the backlog in First Nations housing? We had an AFN ISC needs assessment done a few years ago right across Canada. The Ontario need identified at that time was $4.4 billion for housing and infrastructure, just to get caught up. And I just want to confirm that is your understanding of the need. And I want to know, in tangible terms, what is the plan? What amount of money are you going to invest to deal with the housing backlog? As it relates to off-reserve, many First Nations rent houses. Landlords are repurposing those houses through renovations. They're putting them out. They're getting higher rents. So there's more and more Native people, families becoming homeless because affordability and supply is the issue. And so there has to be capital to build houses. And I want to know, where does your party stand in regard to the government's obligation, Ontario government's obligation to provide capital for on-reserve construction, and also reform in the Ontario Works and ODSP shelter allowances. The shelter allowances do not enable them to pay rent and have groceries. That's the other question. A few years ago, Bill 156 was passed, Security from Trespass Act, and many of our members, and so if someone hunts on a deer in a farmer's field, they could wind up being subject to trespass charges for up to $15,000, and for the first offense, and $25,000 after. There is in Canada's Constitution reserved certain lands under the Royal Proclamation as the Indigenous people's hunting grounds. But after that was not honored by the Crown, and the land was given fee simple as Ontario came into existence and grew and was populated. And so our people have been infringed on and oppressed in the exercise of our access to our traditional food. And I want to know just how you're going to work with the municipalities to correct that so that our people are not subject to this kind of conflict and court cases with the M&R enforcement. So it's how do we exercise our rights in traditional lands and and I guess the settling of land claims. What is your commitment there and what kind of dollars? Because Ontario always tries to sidestep to say, oh, well, it's not really Ontario's responsibility for pre-Confederation treaties. It's Canada's responsibility, but they play the role of an observer and sometimes maybe give a pittance of, and so all of these things are costing the communities a lot of money because the relationship is adversarial. Instead of accepting responsibility and making amends through real terms to correct these wrongs, I'd like to hear what your commitment is in terms of money that your party's prepared to commit to resolve these issues.
Chief Myrtle.
Thank you, Mario, for those questions. And I'll go in order of question asked. So in terms of housing, absolutely. I mean, the state of disrepair on reserve housing, lack of on reserve housing, and also addressing the fact that many off reserve Indigenous folks in urban environments disproportionately are unhoused and homeless is unacceptable. It violates the right to housing that people should have as a human right. And so the Ontario Greens, we put forward a housing affordability strategy that commits $23.5 billion over 4 years. Very honest about how we would pay for it through ending the subsidies for electricity for high-income households and redirecting that money so people who are unhoused and are struggling to be able to find safe, stable housing can afford it, and also to retrofit existing housing. So we've made a funding commitment for the provincial government to fund 22,000 Indigenous-led, Indigenous-owned affordable housing spaces on reserve and off reserve. And it's something it's an issue that's near and dear to my heart. In terms of social assistance rates, yeah, you're absolutely right. Ontario Works, $731 total, which includes the shelter allowance, and for ODSP, $1,100, which, basically any community in Ontario, you can't find a place to live for that. And so we've legislated people on social assistance into deep poverty with tragic consequences in our communities. So we've been calling for the doubling of social assistance rates. That would bring people on ODSP in particular up to the low income cutoff level, which I think is only the decent thing to do. So people can afford to find a place to live and pay the bills and put food on the table. In terms of inherent treaty rights when it comes to traditional lands and hunting, absolutely support that. Successfully moved amendments related to that issue and some bills that have come before the legislature that I know the chiefs that came to committee, and it isn't very often that opposition members get amendments to government bills passed, but thanks to the work I did with the chiefs, we were able to secure some amendments to bills before the legislature, recognizing inherent treaty rights, and we'll continue to work with the chiefs on addressing that in other legislation that is already passed and into law. And then finally, with land claims, I just don't think Ontario, on a whole variety of issues, and I would argue access to safe and clean drinking water, I would put into this as well. I think we have to end the jurisdictional ping pong between the province and the federal government and sit down, in nation to nation, province to nation relationships and negotiations to honor treaties. And a lot of folks who are non-Indigenous don't think of themselves as treaty people, but we're all treaty people. And honoring those treaties and those land claims, I think, are vitally important. and we'll work with the chiefs and all Indigenous communities to have the province fulfill its obligations.
Thank you, Mr. Schreiner. Just a little reminder as to those. We only have a limited amount of time. We have about 10, 11 minutes with Mr. Schreiner for everyone. So if you ask 10 questions in one time, we might not get to the rest of the questions. I do have 3 more chiefs who have a question, Chief Baptiste, Chief LaRocca, and Chief Shining Turtle. So Chief Baptiste.
Good morning. I want to say thanks for participating in all these things. I guess the one concern that we have within our territory, and I would like to get your take on it, is that herbicide spraying within our traditional territories. Is there anything that can be done? Like right now, we were in conflict with, arguing with MNRF for the last 3 years about this stuff, and every place is being sprayed. That affects our ability, for our grandkids to go out onto the land in which we are, we go out basically all the time on the land, and then we run into this herbicide spraying everywhere. So I'd like to know what you would do about this.
Yeah, Chief Baptiste, I've spoken out in the past against particularly aerial spraying, and will continue to speak out against it, and very eager to work with you on this. I mean, to not be able to safely access traditional foods and medicines on the land is wrong.
Yeah, I agree with you there. It is wrong, but like I said, every time we have a meeting with MNRF, and doesn't matter what government people, they always say the same thing. But I think what I'm looking for is something that's concrete, that's something that's gonna, say some sort of a commitment, because it's affecting our people like crazy up here.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's so many naturalized way to manage the land, and I would say, using more Indigenous traditional knowledge, and so yeah, let's put an end to the pollution of the land. And I'm like I said, I've spoken out against it in the past, and happy to work with you to put an end to it moving forward.
Just because, this Roundup stuff, I understand that they stopped using this in the States, and they don't even use that in Quebec province. So I don't know why they want to continue doing it over here. So
absolutely,
that's a concern.
There's definitely other land management practices that can be used that doesn't require spraying.
Yeah. Because the last thing about it, it's a livelihood. Everybody goes out to the land, and they harvest, for fur-bearing animals, and mostly for food as well. And then we even found some moose that had spots on their liver, and then we send it in. We never get a reply back. So we know it's from that, because we're on the land, for pretty much forever.
Exactly.
Anyway, that's my concern. So
thank you, Chief. It's scary enough out there. Never mind that.
Okay, thank you.
Chief LaRocca.
Thanks. Hello, MPP Schreiner. I know you've touched on it a little bit already in your comments, but I just wanted to sort of confirmation around how you believe ministerial zoning orders should be addressed, and whether consultation and accommodation of First Nations should come first. Secondly, I'd like to know your position on how the province should go about relinquishing its monopoly on iGaming, or on gaming in general, I should say. Thirdly, I want to understand your party's position on how to clean or remediate Lake Ontario. It has a host of jurisdictions that apply to it, and it's a bit of a jurisdictional juggernaut. And in the meantime, it just gets more disgusting, quite frankly. And I think people have given up on Lake Ontario to some degree, which is very sad. Not us, of course. And as MPP, lastly, how would you go about supporting local business and organizations through Ontario's reopening and, of course, the continued uncertainty of the pandemic? Miigwech.
Yeah, Chief LaRocca. So first of all, I just want to say Thank you for all the work we were able to do together and stopping the ministerial zoning order for the Amazon warehouse in Duffins Creek. And I absolutely support just a complete overhaul in the way in which ministerial zoning orders are being abused by the current government. There should absolutely be Indigenous consultation and consent, and funding for that consultation. I mean, I know from my conversations with you and other chiefs, just the overwhelming number of consultation requests that come in, and the lack of funding and resources to be able to engage in meaningful consultation is vital. And so, you know, I've been calling for a complete overhaul in the way in which ministerial zoning orders are being abused. I think there are some very, very limited cases in which they can be used. And in my riding in Guelph is one of those where we did consultations with, it received consent from Indigenous treaty holders, as well as local communities around shutting down a quarry that was threatening the groundwater in the region. And so that's one of the very, very rare cases in which a ministerial zoning order was used appropriately. And I've spoken out against many of them, including the one in Cambridge, where there was failure to engage in consultation with Six Nations or Mississaugas of the Credit. And so when it comes to gaming monopoly, I'll have to admit I need to dig into that issue more. And so let's have a conversation around that, and so I can establish a proper position. In terms of cleaning up Lake Ontario, absolutely. I mean, I think we need to be cleaning all the Great Lakes. Ontario and Erie especially are under threat. And that comes from land use patterns. So particularly phosphorus buildup in the lakes, which is why I've supported initiatives around the Great Lakes Protection Act, as well as Lake Simcoe. Lake Simcoe also under significant threat. And I think there's some real huge opportunities, particularly around our commitment to Indigenous-led leadership and funding it with $1 billion around protected areas, and Lake Ontario and all the Great Lakes, frankly, be an important part of that. And then in terms of small businesses, you know, I've been a big supporter of the province providing financial support to small businesses that were closed during the pandemic. I'm deeply concerned, especially the hit that Indigenous tourism operators have experienced, especially in the Northwest, but across the province, and just all small businesses. And so, you know, I think one of the challenges has been that the small business grant, accessing the funding became very challenging for people, and a number of people were denied funding. So making that funding available to a wider range of businesses, I think is going to be vitally important. And I also think we need to be looking at things like Ontario's government procurement processes to make sure that small businesses, and specifically Indigenous businesses, are able to access public procurement opportunities, which is something I think is missing right now. And then finally, we've been strong supporters of business support funds that especially target Indigenous, I would say Black Indigenous women entrepreneurs, because I think we have a whole number of small business owners and entrepreneurs in Ontario that are making huge contributions to job creation and economic prosperity, that are facing significant barriers and challenges to accessing capital. And I think the province has a role in helping them access the funding they need to start up businesses and to scale and expand those businesses.
Mr. Schreiner, I see two more questions that we have on our schedule here, folks. So I'll have to recognize just two more for Mr. Schreiner. We am cognizant of the time. We do have the leader of the New Democratic Party joining us in 5 minutes. So Chief Ogima Shining-Turtle, and then Chief Plain.
Yeah, thank you very much. And Thank you for your generosity today to hear from the leaders. My question is on fiscal federalism. And that's basically how the feds and the province and the municipalities share funding and administer responsibilities within the federal system. But that puts us at conflict with First Nations.
Yeah.
And it's been like that since 1867. So
Yeah.
how do we read, I appreciate you want to jump into my lap and sell yourself. But let me finish the question, and then I know with your generosity and kindness and love, you'll respond accordingly, and all things will be well. So how do we begin the conversation to allow First Nations a share of our own wealth? Because this is what's locking us out, is this fiscal federalism, and it's been there since 1867. Unlocking this is really the key to unlocking the growth potential and the well-being of Indigenous people in Ontario. Miigwech.
Yeah, Miigwech, and sorry to jump in there. I thought you were finished, so my apologies. Absolutely, like I completely agree. I'm so tired of this jurisdictional ping pong ball that exists on a number of issues, and I think that's why, you know, Ontario needs to be at the table, the federal government needs to be at the table, and First Nations need to be at the table to discuss how we're going to fix this and solve it once and for all. I mean, I think one of the most important pieces is free informed prior consent for development on traditional lands and ensuring equity ownership for First Nations, so that you know, the owners of a lot of these projects, and so that benefits flow to Indigenous communities. So in the interest of time, I'm going to leave it at that to get the last question in. But absolutely, this is such a critical and vital issue to economic empowerment and prosperity for First Nations.
Thank you. Chief Plain.
Okay, Miigwech, first of all, I'd like to welcome you here today and thank you for participating. Also, I want to indicate that some of the questions of the former leaders are not just one-offs for their particular communities, that we all agree. They've made some great points that I won't, you know, again, go over. I'd like to just first off, I've got two quick questions for you. One, first, I'd like to thank you for the acknowledgement for the regulations and standards around recently set CO2. Of course, I'm Chief of Amjadong First Nation, and my concern is that with regard to non-compliance. So there is some penalties in there for non-compliance. However, those penalties will come back to the province if the industry is not compliant with meeting those targets. Excuse me. So recently, in recent times, the local justice has indicated when industries are fined, portions of that come to us. So instead of relying on the courts to determine that, can we not expect the provincial government to indicate that those who are mostly affected would receive some of those penalty fines? That's my first question. The second question is, for those of us who have on-reserve gas stations where non-natives are required to pay tax, ours generally collects a lot of taxation money, and we don't receive any of that back in the Good Roads type of initiative. And so we're collecting, and it's actually going to the local municipality, who doesn't in turn share it with us or pave any of the roads in our community that they have jurisdiction over. So quickly, I'll just end it with that, and look forward to your response. Miigwech.
And Miigwech, and absolutely, the fines need to be returned in your particular case to Amjadong First Nation. And let's just be real honest, and this is mostly for the non-Indigenous viewers this morning. If there was ever, you know, an indication of what environmental racism looks like, it's the ring of chemical plants around your First Nation, and just the lack of proper monitoring and enforcement. And now that we're starting to see some enforcement, the fact that the fines don't go back to the people most directly affected is just wrong. And you have my commitment to working with you to fix that. And absolutely, I've had the conversation around HST tax collection and the fact that those financial resources don't flow back to First Nations to be able to make improvements on reserve, and we have to fix that. I absolutely agree with you on that. And so you have my commitment to doing what I can in the legislature to work with the chiefs on those issues.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schreiner, for joining us. I do have
Thank
one
you very
question.
much for those answers.
Thank you, Chief. Let me go for those questions, and thank you everyone for their participation in our conversation. Mr. Schreiner, I do have one question, and it's a process question, and it's being asked to me in the chat. It's around continuing this conversation. So I know that this was a compressed time frame. We only had 45 minutes with you, but I think a lot of the leadership out there would like to continue this conversation and engage with you and your team moving forward. So I'm just asking if that's a possibility and how that might happen.
That is absolutely a possibility, and my team will do everything we can to work with you to make that happen. And more than anything, I would really just be honored and have deep gratitude for the opportunity to visit communities and meet in person as well. Especially, hopefully, we can put this pandemic behind us, because I think developing those meaningful and deep relationships are so valuable, and I think that can best be accomplished when we have the opportunity to meet in person and tell stories and share history and build respectful relationships. So I'm absolutely committed to continuing this conversation, both collectively with the chiefs and individually with communities across the province.
Thank you very much for joining us, and do take care. Till next time, and the conversation continues, and best of luck during the election.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be with you today.
Take care. Oh, you can always join us on YouTube, see how everyone else is responding.
There we go, exactly.
So thank you very much for that. And we have our next guest who's joining us, who is the leader of the New Democratic Party of Ontario, Andrea Horwath, who is joining us today. So just a process question. I know that what I'm trying to do is create a respectful environment for everyone to say their questions. And I understand everyone has 3 or 4 questions. If we put 3 or 4 questions together, it's the less time I have to get to other questions, although that one kind of worked out well. I know that if they're different topics, then that's awesome that we get all the different topics on the table and we have a conversation. So the first one went well. I'm just worried if we get 5 questions from everyone, I won't be able to get to all the Chiefs' questions. So 2 or 3 is fine. A little bit more, we might have a challenge in getting everyone's questions in. I'm looking to my list to make sure our leader of the New Democratic Party is here with us. Chief King, did you have a question on our process?
I have a question for the MPP once she's done her. I want to get in the queue here because otherwise you forget about me and say not enough time. So thank you, sir.
Okay, well, thank you. I'll go to our leader of the New Democratic Party of Ontario, Andrea Horwath. We do have about 15 minutes, Ms. Horwath, for a presentation, and then I'll open the floor for a conversation. The floor is all yours. So welcome.
Oh, thank you so much. And I'm really happy to be here this morning. My understanding was that Saul Mamakwa was going to be with me as well. I don't know if Saul's here or not, but I certainly hope that he is, and that our conversation was going to include Saul as well. But I want to start by letting you know that I'm here and I'm joining you from Toronto, which is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, and the Anishinaabe, including Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, on lands that are protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation. And as I was in the waiting room listening to a little bit of your conversation, the word conversation was being used by you. So I'm glad that we're talking together in a conversational way, and not just about the issues that your communities are facing now, but how do we work going forward to build a better Ontario for First Nations peoples. That is extremely important to me, and I know it's important to you. And the only way we can do that is with governments that respect the fact that we're all treaty people. And I think that everything flows from that. That respect is necessary. It's a foundational piece, the understanding of that, and that's where everything flows from. But also a government that actually steps up and honors its responsibilities in terms of the provincial government, as well as partnering with First Nations leadership in that government to government relationship that we know is required to fix the things that have been broken for a very long time. I want to thank you for the introduction, Matthew, and I want to thank Regional Chief Hare, as well as all the chiefs of Ontario, the Executive Council, for having me here today. And thank you for your strong leadership. You continue to lead your people in a very strong and thoughtful way, leading your communities, of course, through an even more challenging time than what we've seen in a while. It's been very, very turbulent and really, really troubling. I'm really proud of the relationship that we continue to build. And I know that there are times when things happen where we reach out, and I want you to know that at any time that you want to reach out to me, I'm certainly here, and I will hopefully, be in the same situation where I have an ability to reach out to you. And some of the chiefs we've already had that kind of a relationship, and I'm hoping we can continue with exactly that. I want to thank actually Saul while I'm here too. At the beginning of my comments, Saul Mamakwa and his team have done a really great job. He's taken an amazing leadership role within our team here at Queen's Park and within our party, ensuring that First Nations knowledge, lived experience, perspectives are part of the conversation, part of the discussion, part of the decision making, that they literally inform the work that we do as an opposition party, and for that I'm eternally grateful. I know that the pandemic has not only deepened the struggles that many communities face, but also some of the challenges that continue to be ongoing for decades and decades in First Nations communities made the impact of the pandemic that much more deep. The risk and the vulnerability that communities have when there's overcrowded housing, when there's lack of healthcare, when there's harsh weather, all of those things made the impact of the pandemic a lot worse on First Nations communities, and that's just not acceptable. But these are the things that, as I said earlier, need to be fixed, and we're certainly committed to working with you to do exactly that. We've seen little or no movement on truth and reconciliation pathways. We've seen really very little on the recommendations coming out of the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls process. That's just not good enough. We spend the time to do this work, and then recommendations sit on shelves and gather dust while people continue to suffer and progress continues to be lacking. It's not acceptable. And of course, over the last couple of years, with the trauma and pain surrounding the thousands of discoveries of children's remains buried on residential school sites, it's been horrific. And I think that those situations just continue to create more trauma, expose the wounds of the intergenerational trauma that First Nations peoples deal with, that Indigenous peoples deal with in our province. And I don't believe that we're doing enough to be there to support the work that's being done in that regard. And so I just want to let you know that when we're talking about those beloved little ones that didn't come home, and when we're talking about the family members and the communities that never stopped searching for those children, you have a partner in the Ontario NDP. Of course, you're the leaders in this regard. It's your activities, your decisions, your processes that must be respected. But certainly, we will do everything that we can to support your work and provide what's necessary in terms of assistance and supports, not only for the process of continuing to do the searching, but also to support communities through the traumatic experiences as more discoveries are uncovered. I know that I was looking through the document that you provided, and I want to thank you for all of the important work that you've done. But for generations, you've been facing governments that have not done right by you or your people. And I think the phrase you use is through countless election cycles, you continue to raise similar issues and continue to talk to governments about their obligations, their responsibilities, and the things your communities need. And yet here we are in 2022, literally on the doorstep of another election cycle with unsafe housing and overcrowded housing on many reserves. Land claims that continue to be unresolved, lack of economic opportunity, unsafe water, and then of course the other pieces around the systems that simply continue to fail your people, discrimination in the justice system, in education, in child welfare, of course, access to healthcare, which I've already mentioned. All of these things need to be addressed and resolved, and it's shameful. It's a shame on Ontario that these things have not, to this point in time, been addressed. So I do want you to know that my team and myself, we're ready to go from the conversation to the action, go from the talking about it to the actually fixing of these things. We're committed to ensuring that not yet another government or another election cycle is in the rearview mirror, and nothing changes. That's just not acceptable to me personally. And what I want to see is a future where no further generations have to fight the same battles that you've been fighting for several generations now already. But I do know the obligations that we have as a province are to work in a government-to-government relationship, to have that respect, as I mentioned. But it's the jurisdictional ping pong has to go. So you may recall that in the last election, we talked about cleaning up the water and sending the bill to Ottawa because the ping pong that goes on there is horrifying, and the communities are suffering so badly when it comes to the water crisis. We know that Grassy Narrows, finally, there's some action happening on the treatment center, but we still have the poisoned English and Wabigoon river systems, and that's not good enough. We need to get some action on the actual cleanup of the water. We've got in our platform, and again, I don't want to talk particularly in the use of the word platform, but we do recognize and acknowledge that housing is a huge issue. And so what we're talking about is housing that is for Indigenous people, led by Indigenous people. And so that's a commitment that we have. It's to build over 22,000 new homes and to really work hard with the crisis that's happening on reserve in a number of the communities. Culturally, so we talk about healthcare, we talk about mental health care, we talk about addictions and all those pieces, and in every piece, we make sure we're being thoughtful and respectful around these kinds of programs, not only being accessible and available, but also being culturally appropriate, because we know that that's absolutely a requirement. I guess my point is there's no time like right now to start actually building that future, building new and lasting, equitable institutions and ones that are led by you, and to finally relegate colonialism to a part of our history instead of continuing to deal with the impacts of colonialism day in and day out. I don't know how much, I don't want to take all the time. I know you have questions. I still have some things to say. Oh, look, my staff is showing me how much time I've taken already. Just a few more quick things. We have a commitment to put in place the Treaty Commission of Ontario, as was recommended by the Ipperwash inquiry. This has not yet been done, and we need to do that. We've also included a resource revenue sharing, making sure that 100% of mining taxes are going directly to First Nations communities, a provincial strategy to deal with the youth suicide crisis, also with targeted funding for universal mental health care under OHIP, which is awesome. The child welfare system, again, is something we need to address. I was elected in 2004. I was the critic for Children and Youth Services, and the child welfare system was, the situation was made clear to me back then. And here we are all these years later with serious problems existing. Child welfare should be under the control of your communities, but with the resources that you need to provide the supports to families and kids. UNDRIP, implementation of UNDRIP. At the end of the day, I hope that you can go to our website, ontariondp.ca, look at what's there on our platform, and let me know, let us know if we have it right, if there are things you want to see that we don't have, because as was mentioned, this is a conversation, but it's also a commitment, and it's the only way we walk a path together. So thanks very much. I appreciate it. And I didn't realize, I just got a note as well that Saul is not joining us, but that's okay. I'm looking forward to your questions and the conversation. Thanks so much, Chiefs.
I didn't mean to rush you, Ms. Horwath. You do
That's
have
okay.
more time if you wish, if you have any other messages you want to share, and we can go to the Chiefs afterwards. So I didn't.
It's all good. I don't like being a talking head. I like conversation. So it's great. Thank you, Matthew.
Perfect. Chief King.
Good morning, and thank you, Andrea, for joining us today, for the courage to come and sit with us and hear our concerns. First of all, sort of a commentary I have here, the Thunder Bay Superior North riding, Mr. Gravel is not running for health reasons, and I see that as an opportunity for your candidate, Lise Bourgeois, in winning that seat. And the reason why I say that is she came very close to winning that seat in the last election when Mr. Gravel has been there for 27 years and everybody loves him and everybody votes for him. And she was only short 900 votes, or a little bit less than 900 votes. So, and being a cabinet minister, the NDP could have won that seat in the Thunder Bay Superior riding. The other riding is the Thunder Bay Atikokan riding held by Judith Monteith Farrell. And I think those two ridings are the NDP has a very, very good chance of holding that riding, but also winning the Thunder Bay Superior North riding. And knowing that Mr. Gravel, very, very good politician, I think he's done a lot for everybody in this area. But, and I think people voted for him because of the person, not so much of the party. And it's reminiscent of the late Jack Stokes, who was MPP for this riding as well, Lake Nipigon riding. And, he was, a very, very good politician, but worked very hard on behalf of all the people. And again, I take my hats off to Sol Mamakwa as well, very strong advocate for people in the legislature. My question is that, and I think that, and again, for the First Nations that are here, I really think that there has to be some sort of change in terms of the relationship between the provincial crown and First Nations people. And the only way you're going to instrument that change is having people in that legislature that's going to advocate on behalf of your communities. And I would like to see, more of the First Nations getting involved strategically in the specific ridings, and that goes for the federal ridings as well. And having said that, I know that, people use that political football saying, well, it's federal jurisdiction or it's provincial jurisdiction. And not to go on some of my comments of the previous speakers, but the agreement that was signed by the federal NDP and the federal Liberals, I have no problem with that agreement where the federal NDP had propped up the Liberals to stay in office for 2025. But the problem I have is I don't believe, and I certainly wasn't consulted in that, and I don't expect to be consulted in that, but I don't know if the leadership was ever consulted in that, because what I see happening at our level is that you mentioned land claims, and you said the resolution of land claims, but yet it's the federal Liberals under the leadership of Justin Trudeau that's stalling our land claims. So when Mr. Jagmeet Singh props up, the Liberals and keeps them in office for 2025, are they really going to address the issues of land claims with First Nations across Canada? So we have a long outstanding claim as well. It's dealing with our reserve boundary. And I'm not here to, I wish I had a chance to question Premier Ford, but it appears to me that the Premier Ford's government is willing to settle the land claims but yet it's the federal Liberals that are stalling the land claims. And I don't understand that, because you would think it would be the opposite, where you'd see the federal Liberals wanting to settle the land claims, and yet the provincial Conservatives trying to stall them. So I don't have a question. It's just a commentary, and I think people should be aware of that. And again, I'm kind of concerned that this agreement signed between the NDP and the federal Liberals, there seems to be no checks and balances. And what it gets down to is minority governments. And I think if there's a minority government in the next election, and whoever gets in, you always use that minority government as a tool to advocate on behalf of your people. So you don't have to answer that question. It's just a political commentary from Gull Bay First Nation. Miigwech.
I think I'll give you a chance to answer there.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Chief King Miigwech. I first of all, thank you for acknowledging the work of Lise Vougeois, as well as Judith Monteith Farrell up in Thunder Bay, and Mike Revelle. I've known him for years, right? He's been here for years. He's been here as long as I have, maybe a little longer. And I wish him the best. He served the public a lot, first as mayor, as you probably know, and then as the MPP, and he's a heck of a nice guy. So I don't disagree. I mean, I totally agree with you that sometimes it's, people just, they take seriously the serving of their community, and they then receive a great deal of loyalty and love from people. So I would agree with you on that. I was interested to hear about the sense you have that the Ford government is willing to solve land claims. Certainly, I would be happy to get further information on that. We're in this election to win this time. We are going in with 40 seats. The Liberals only have 7. They can't beat the current government. And I mean, I know you're not necessarily wanting to hear about our political strategy, but certainly we're interested in forming government. We're not interested in forming a minority government. We're interested in forming government. But whatever the electorate decides, we will respect, obviously, as you do in your elections. But I do want to assure you that the kinds of priorities that I talked about in my formal remarks are not going anywhere. And if you're feeling that if we are successful in this campaign, and there are things that you think are working, that the current government's doing well, then I'm open to hearing about that too. And it's not a matter of everything that Doug Ford does is terrible. If there are things that people are really finding successful, then I'm prepared to obviously respect that and continue in that direction. Unfortunately, where I come from, I'm as a New Democrat, I have a lot of concerns with the direction of this particular government, and that's why we're going to fight so hard. But thanks for mentioning about Lise, and about Judith. They're wonderful women. And Lise is running again for us, I'm sure you know.
I do see an iPad, and I'm thinking that's Chief Collins.
Yes, Matthew, it's Chief Collins here at Fort William, still dealing with the COVID fog. Hopefully get better in the next day or two, but getting better. So thank you for joining us, Andrea, and good morning, everyone, and to the elder for starting us off in a nice way. My question to you, Andrea, if you form government, taxation is an issue that a lot of our contractors that are working on Crown land and working in the forestry are paying in taxation on fuel supplies and carbon tax. Will your government lift the taxation rights of our First Nation people? As you know, part of the treaty was not to be taxable First Nation community members and working, and we did sign the treaty with the Crown, and we're working on Crown land, and our contractors are being levied with 8% tax and carbon tax and all different kinds of taxes that are being imposed upon them when they're purchasing fuel. So my question, would you lift that taxation issue so our contractors are not paying that 8% and the carbon tax and the other taxes that should not be attached to it? So I asked that question of you today if you form government. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Chief Collins, Miigwech. So there's a couple of things. First of all, we plan on bringing a new cap and trade plan into Ontario, and in the process of putting that plan together, we will be addressing exactly the kinds of things that you're talking about. So the carbon tax, as it sits now, is in place in Ontario, as I'm sure you know, because the Ford government got rid of the cap and trade that the former government had put in place, and so we're captured then in the federal program. We believe that we can do better for Ontario, and we can build a response to the climate crisis in cooperation with First Nations communities, with industry, with NGOs and others to really battle the climate crisis that's upon us. And so we will be absolutely engaging with you because our commitment is to build the fight against the climate crisis in our Green New Democratic deal on the pillars of respect for First Nations and Indigenous communities. And so that's one of the pillars of our plan. And so, of course, we identify that in esoteric ways, right, as part of our values, but we can't actually detail out what that pillar looks like unless we're having that government-to-government conversation with you about what it looks like. And so what I'm hearing from you is it looks like taking seriously the issue around taxation that is currently in place that doesn't follow through with our obligations, our crown obligations, the crown's obligations rather, in terms of taxation. So I look forward to becoming the government and having that very conversation with you and others, First Nations leadership, around how do we fulfill that pillar of that relationship.
So I guess just to follow up, Matthew, sorry, I know there's others want to ask the question, but 8% tax that is being levied against our contractors also, and they're working on Crown land, and we are signature to the treaty with the Crown, and I really I'm disappointed that suppliers are charging their contractors in the forestry sector and other sectors that are being tax being levied against them. So I hope that your government takes that into very serious.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Chief Collins. Chief Duckworth.
Bonjour, Andrea. I'm glad that you were able to take the time today. My name is Mary Duckworth. I represent Caldwell First Nation. I'm pleased to be here today. And there are a few items I'd like to talk to you about. Andrea, I followed you for quite a long time. And so the things that I'd like to talk to you about are mental health and addictions. Two of the most troubling states that we find ourselves in are dealing with our First Nations people that have mental health and addictions issues, and their lack of being able to be served on the First Nation due to underfunding, and their lack of being able to be served off the nation due to Ontario's lack of funding. The wait list to go in to be able to detox. There are a lot of roadblocks out there for our people right now. And I come to you from Caldwell First Nation, Andrea. We are the most southern First Nation in Canada. So we're down in the southwest, the beautiful warm weather. And as you know, it was populated first for Ontario. It was one of the most populated areas with the settlers. And what we find ourselves in, knowing that we're not able to have funding enough to be able to deal with our own mental health and addictions, what I'm finding in southwestern Ontario is Lake Erie is my lake, or our lake, for the Three Fires Confederacy. And there's take water. So that I would like to be addressed when you come into office in June. And the other piece is the fact that the housing is not being addressed. We have people couch surfing on our nations, off our nations. And I'm really concerned about that. So I know the big three: mental health, addictions, and housing. And from a political point, is in Southwestern Ontario, I know right now that they don't have enough energy to feed the growth that's happening. There was a new battery plant, electric car announced in Windsor. Right now, there's not enough energy to support that manufacturing place. And the federal and provincial government need to consult with the First Nations. It's not just a word, it's a responsibility that I take seriously. And I hope your leadership in Ontario will take seriously. I don't want to take up too much time, but I do want to stress to you that mental health addictions, our children are still being taken. Not much has changed other than I see the governments are trying to send some money out. What we need is somebody to listen to us, somebody to work with us, and somebody to understand us so that we can address the needs in our own community. So I say miigwech for listening today.
Well, thank you, Chief Duckworth. A number of the things that you raised are things that we've been addressing or trying to address for a long time. We've been trying to push former governments, including this one, to take seriously the mental health and addictions crisis that's facing so many communities and so many people around the province. And it's gotten worse, as you probably know, throughout COVID. And we have an obligation to provide people with the tools that they need to build a good life, to overcome addictions, to get supports, therapies, and counseling, and treatment for mental health. Mental health pain is just as serious as physical pain, and we really need to address the lack of mental health services. And so we do have a big plan for exactly that. But we also talk in our plan about making sure that there are culturally appropriate services being provided, and that's something that we are committed to, because it doesn't work. You can't get mental health supports from someone who doesn't understand your culture, who has no idea of your history, of your intergenerational trauma that you might be carrying. It's absolutely necessary. We are going to train many more people in mental health provision of mental health services. We are going to provide opportunities for social workers and nurses and other primary care providers to train them and pay for that training, so they don't have to pay for it themselves, to upgrade their skills to be able to provide some of those services as we build a mental health system, because we don't have one, as you probably know. There is no system. It's a patchwork, and depending on who you are, where you are, how much money you make, you might not get the services that you need. And you'll be able to pay for those services through your OHIP card. So we're bringing mental health and addiction services into our OHIP system. So then everything I've just said about mental health, we know the relationship often, not always, but often, between, for example, trauma and self-medication and substance abuse. But that's not the only causation for people who are struggling with substance use, but absolutely that we are committed to helping people through their journey. And whether that's things like access to services, we thought it was shameful that the current government put a cap on the supervised consumption and treatment sites. We don't agree with that. We're going to get rid of that cap. We want to see the decriminalization of possession of drugs. We want to clean up the poison drug supply, and these are all things that we need to do to give to prevent people from losing their lives to the opioid crisis, as well as the addictions crisis overall, on all ways. And that means increasing beds for detox, as you talked about. And if I recall, I had this conversation, I think, with Chief Collins as well, about how important it is to have those beds available and to make sure that people have access to them. But then there's also, this is what Chief and I were talking about, actually, that there's also ongoing supports, so it doesn't become a revolving door of you detox, you maybe get a residential bed for a couple of weeks, maybe a month, and then you're back out on your own without any support. So that's where some of the counseling and therapies also tie in. And that's only one of the things that you raised. And so there's a lot of, we do have in our platform, we do have a complete water strategy. We need to protect the water in our province. What's happening now, the water taking permits, the poisoning of water, the lack of respect for the watersheds across our province, a government that wants to, build highways through environmentally sensitive lands. All of these things are unacceptable. And so we do have an entire piece of our climate plan that speaks to water. And of course, I know how much we need to engage with you and First Nations communities on that effort, because it's what you've been doing for your entire history as a people, and we need to be very thoughtful and respectful about that. In terms of housing, we also do have, not only do we have a pretty robust housing plan, and it includes everything from building social housing again, because we all know that the market will not ever take care of the deepest need, or the deepest core is what we used to call it, or we still call it in terms of need. So 100,000 new homes, but also 22,000 specifically for First Nations and Indigenous folks, led by Indigenous peoples. So that's an engagement that we are committed to, and ensuring that the housing meets the needs of community and is led by you. Frankly, but also we want to, we're committing to supportive housing. So social housing, yes, affordable housing, social housing, but also supportive housing, so that people who perhaps have been unhoused for a while, or as you described, have been couch surfing for a while, might need some supports to maintain their housing. So once they get a roof over their head, once they get a social housing unit, what are the supports to help them stay housed? Similarly, people who are struggling with alcohol and with drug addictions and with mental health and other developmental challenges, for example, how do we make sure that there isn't a revolving door where they get housed, and then because there's no supports, and the next thing you know, they're on the streets again? So we've thought about all of these things, and they're a part of our plan, and so much more. Our platform is fairly big, as I said, but the housing that's the social housing side of it. We also talk about private market housing. How do we get the speculators out? How do we stop the prices from spiraling? How do we get back to a place where we can have that missing middle housing, where people can actually buy their first home, because there are semis and townhouses and kind of the middle level entryway into the housing market. There's a lot in there, and we've thought very carefully about the things that are broken and the challenges that people are facing in Ontario that we need to fix. Energy as well. You're correct, and again, it's one of those things that we need to be partnering with you in terms of any process that has any impact whatsoever, positive and negative, on your First Nation. That's something we are committed to. I don't know, there might be other things. Child apprehension, apprehension of children at birth, and all of that, those kinds of terrible practices that continue to this day, unacceptable. And we need to work with you closely to totally not only reform our child welfare system in Ontario, like the Crown's child welfare system, but make sure that the communities, Indigenous communities, First Nations communities particularly, are able to take over the child welfare systems for your communities and have the supports financially and the resources to be able to do that, and help families and children going into the future. I might have missed something.
Miigwech, just to end, just to think about something, food for thought, Andrea.
Yep.
Is maybe if the province can remove themselves from their perceived obligation to look after our health money, and if we could create a direct relationship with the federal government, I think the funds would do us better to create exactly what you're trying to create, and we could do it within our territories and with our other First Nation partners. So I say miigwech, and I'll keep watching the television to see how things go.
There's a question in the chat, Ms. Horwath, about clarification around the 22,000 new homes. I guess, was there also a portion of those specifically for Indigenous peoples?
That is the actual, that is the 22,000 Indigenous homes are for Indigenous peoples, absolutely. But that's only a piece of the obligation, because we also know that on your territories there's a housing crisis as well. So we know that people are living on territories or in your communities, as well as in the broader community, in cities and towns all across Ontario. And we want to make sure that we're providing that housing on both in both places, wherever people are.
Thank you. Chief Carr.
Ani Minogajab, MPP Horwath. My name is Lori Carr. I'm the chief for Hiawatha First Nation, and we're located just outside Peterborough on the north shore of Rice Lake, a small community. And but my questions, you've answered some, or you've spoke around some of the questions, but so I might only have some comments, but you first will go to the housing. You've talked about the 22,000 units. I would say that's a kind start without sounding smart. I'm a small community with over 160 families on my waiting list for housing. And so when we talk about this need, we have this need for transitional housing, low income, and affordable housing. And then when we get to that point, we also talk about our land base. And people do want to move home. So we have been purchasing back our stolen land. We're at 150 acres, which is, it runs into the ATR process. And I know that's a federal process. But in the meantime, my question here is, with the NDP, can they look at removing those municipal taxes from those lands that have been purchased back by the First Nation? This would open it up, and without having to charge our people taxes to live on those lands. Right now in my community, I have two service lots available. That's it. So, but I also have 150 acres that are in an ATR process. I know that's not yours, but let's talk about the taxes that are municipal taxes and having them removed from these lands. The second piece is, or that flows into that, is we talked about mental health. One of my, I will just say near and dear, personal to me. Right now, we're in a crisis. We always have been. We've always been below. However, Ontario and the feds do their measurements on the general population, we're always below that. If we don't fit into your criteria of measurement, your data, and given our history, we've always remained below that. And so to even bring us up to will take some work. It'll take human resources and financial resources. And I know you had mentioned that you would bring these services to OHIP, but would that also allow these services through OHIP to be in our communities? We're working on, we have our old administration building that we've transitioned into a mental health and addictions and support building, but we do lack the resources and the human resources to be able to get this up and running properly. And you did talk about post and pre-care. We following treatment, we do need post and pre-care. And how does that work for, when we talk about treatment, are we looking at more funding for First Nations to have treatment access or treatments in the community? I'd love to see that this become an all-encompassing. I would say I could go down my community, my little community, and at least one person in every household, has a mental health, whether it be anxiety, depression, or more so going on in their home. And then when we talk about the treatments, when we talk about addiction treatments, my citizens have had to go to Blind River. That's an 8-hour trip. And that's if you're being driven, or almost 8 hours, and much longer if they had to go by bus. So, in this area, treatment is very much needed here in the Peterborough and surrounding area, including our First Nation. And then also part of that fits into that is I just want to make a comment in regards to COVID. So I had talked about how we are already below the any measurement on a scale. And so when we talk about COVID and what we're seeing right now, so we're behind now, we're 2 years behind, but we're also seeing that in education. We're seeing that in developmental, where our young people and because our childcare centers and everybody's been home and isolated and open and closed. And what we're seeing now is these delays and a lot of anxiety in our young people. A lot of social anxiety, not wanting to go back to school. I'm hearing this a number of times from a number of families here. And so I don't want anyone to slip in between the cracks, especially here in my community. And so, we have our work to do here. But again, I need to reach out and say, we will need those human and that expertise and those financial resources to be able, because if we're already behind and now COVID puts us 2 years behind, and then what's that going to look like in 2 years from now for our young people who are struggling? And so, I'd rather be, get on the ball now, so to speak, to be able to help our community through this process. And so those are the types of things, plus everything everyone else has said so far. As First Nations all across Ontario, I know that we have very similar issues, just maybe varying degrees, but we all have very similar issues regardless of where we're located. So thank you to my colleagues for bringing up those other questions and comments and issues. But I will leave it there and just say miigwech, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Chief Carr. I don't know, I really appreciate the detail of the conversation in regards to your community, and it certainly is. I think it's something that I'm absolutely committed to doing, which is to not make any assumptions about, first of all, what your needs are, but second of all, how we work with you to ensure that the needs are met. And so when I talk about our mental health and addictions commitments that are in our kind of platform, to have those things be effective for your community, and similarly with housing, is to make sure that we're having that engagement at the beginning, and identifying people who might be able to be service providers that can access some of the training and provide and then be employed in doing that work in your communities. And of course that the flow of resources goes to community, and then the community will be the ones to direct how that those supports are being provided. But that's the way I look at it, is that we don't do anything without you as a partner at the table and directing exactly how it will work best for your community.
Okay, miigwech, Ms. Horwath. Just wanted to add one thing to that piece when we talk about the housing, and I meant to add that, is when you think of our First Nations, or again, I can't speak for other First Nations, but my own, when we talk about also opening up those lands, that we're also looking at, 10 million plus to open up those lands and build the roadways into that. So, that all has to come part and parcel with housing. So I'll leave it again. Sorry, miigwech. Thank you.
Yes, there was 100 acres that Chief Carr was talking about. And is there any remediation that can happen until it's turned into a reserve in terms of the land and taxes that are required from the municipality. I don't know if you.
Oh, so yeah, so I get it. Okay, so yeah, I guess the piece that I think the provincial government's role is in that is to ensure that if there's a resistance from a municipality, that the Crown or that the Ontario government be the one to step up and ensure that the taxes are dealt with. And so whether that's regulation around the municipal tax system itself, or whether that's a financial commitment to make whole the municipality. But at the end of the day, either one of those solutions would address what you're talking about.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. Chief Michon. I think you're still muted, Chief. Sorry. There you go.
Macho. Thank you, Andrea, for coming and listening to all us chiefs. Sometimes sitting in front of chiefs is a pretty stressful undertaking. Anyways, I want to, I guess, reinforce what Chief Duckworth and Chief Carr have talked about in regards to mental health. That was my issue I was going to talk to you about. Like I said, the mental health system in Ontario is broken. And there's a disconnect really between the physical health system, the physicians in the hospital, and the mental health system. There's a definite disconnect there, and that there needs to be an overlap in the connection between the physical health and the mental health system. And when a physician in a hospital, they're the first line of defense, really, to tell you the truth. And they see what's going on with their patients, but they have no way to refer those patients onto a mental health system and to either a psychiatrist or a psychologist. So that's broken. And when you look at the mental health system in Northern Ontario, and particularly for the youth, the regional hospital in Thunder Bay has 8 beds, and that serves an area from Wawa to the Manitoba border, from Lake Superior to James Bay. A huge catchment area with 8 beds for youth. They do good work, but you just don't have enough beds there. That's one thing. The other thing that we're trying to do here in the North Superior region is to create a detox center for youth, particularly for youth, and that would be a culturally appropriate detox center, because in order for the youth to go on to treatment and land-based treatment centers, doesn't matter where it is, they need to detox. The treatment centers won't take them, and there's no detox centers for those kids. There's a detox center in Thunder Bay, right in the urban area, but it's for adults. There's nothing, and it's not culturally appropriate for First Nations. So we need to work together to try to create those detox centers. We have put that on the table at the Anishinaabe Nation level, at the North Superior Chiefs level. So we would like to put that somewhere within our North Superior region to treat our youth. And I had a good, interesting conversation with Lise Bourgeois about 2 weeks ago. She's the candidate in my riding, and we had a good conversation just about that whole mental health issue. So I'm looking forward to having further conversations with Lise. And if you get in as the government, whoever minister is the Minister of Health, and maybe even yourselves, about the whole issue about mental health and detox centers and land-based treatment centers, because we have to catch those youth at that level. We can't wait till they're adults and on the streets and are struggling basically to even look after themselves. We got to get them when they're young. And unfortunately, the whole issue in regards to opioids and for even marijuana and other hard drugs are too available. Even when legislation needs to change too, but a lot of this is at the federal level to make it easier for First Nations to deal with those issues on their communities. And right now, legislation is not there to allow us to do that. And even if we were able to clean things up in our communities, you go into the municipality and it's all available right there. And so legislation needs to change as well at the provincial level and the municipal level to make it easier for law enforcement people to deal with drug dealers and the availability of drugs. And legislation needs to change also in regards to the availability of opioids in clinics and the doctor's offices. So there's a whole host of things, but again, that detox center, I think, is a focus for us to try to clean our youth up so that they can go on to treatment centers and get back to school and make themselves, I guess, available for the workforce. So Miigwech, look forward to talking to you and Lise and whoever's health minister in the future.
Thank you, Chief. Go ahead, Ms. Horwath.
Thanks, Matthew. Thank you, Chief Machado. I really appreciate your insights and your thoughtfulness around the necessity to really put something in place that focuses and prioritizes the youth. And I agree with you wholeheartedly in that regard. And I think that one of the things that you said really, it made me think about the, I think it was what you were talking about, the Minister of Health, and the Minister of Health needs to be in kind of thoughtful and focused on these issues. And it reminds me of the what I think is an important piece that I don't know whether whether government of Ontario has done in the last number of years. I really don't know this past government as well as the Liberal government, whether they did or they didn't. But it's really about making sure that that not only does Saul-Memacwa and our other Indigenous identifying members of the government, if we form government, have an understanding and perspective of First Nations leadership and of the treaties and the obligations and of requirements around the government to government relationship, as well as the obligations for prior and informed consent on projects. I think this refers back to some of the previous conversation, but that has to be like, so every minister of the Crown and every assistant to the minister, the parliamentary assistants, as well as the bureaucracy, the deputy ministers, that work, I don't know if that work has been done in any robust way or if it's been done at all. But we would be looking to folks like you, Chiefs of Ontario and others, to make sure that that we are getting that right and that we're putting in place an understanding of across government ministries of what needs to be done in terms of the relationships, because otherwise we're not going to ever get to a place where we're fixing the things that are broken. And just on the psychologist, psychiatrist, you talked about the mental health piece and people getting some treatment. I talked earlier about us in our plan to build actually a mental health system, because you're right, people do end up in the emergency wards of hospitals in mental health crisis when had we given them, provided them with the kinds of supports they needed, the kind of counseling, the kind of therapy that they needed, they might not have ended up in the hospital. So that's a big part of, we're trying to prevent people from ending up in total crisis and in a hospital bed. But even if that is the outcome and somebody is in the hospital, you're right in identifying that there's no place to refer them to. So they spend a day or two in the hospital, and then they're out of the hospital, but there's still no treatment and no capacity in communities to provide that treatment. So not only are we making that commitment around counseling and therapy, I think I talked about engaging social workers and nurses and family docs, primary care providers, community health centers in that effort, but also that we're increasing the number of psychologists and psychiatrists that are going through our medical systems, our medical education systems, because we are very short when it comes to having that level of service available too. So I wanted to just kind of follow up on that.
Yep.
Thank you very much. I have 3 more chiefs who have a question, and I have no more time.
Yeah, okay. Just want to add something. Our jails are full of people with mental health problems. They need to be in a hospital somewhere being treated for mental issues and not in jail.
I agree.
What I'd like to do with the 3 remaining chiefs, I have Chief Miracle, I have Deputy Grand Chief Jim Bob, and I have Chief LaRocco. And what I would ask is each of you ask the questions, and then I'll go to Mrs. Horwath to answer them, as opposed to doing 3 in a different time. So Chief Miracle.
Thank you very much, Andrea, and for joining us, and I appreciate and best of luck in the election. My questions are, the 22,000 houses you say you're going to build, how many of those are for on reserve? Because we need to know that, and I need to know the budget that you're committed to building, because the pandemic has certainly affected the cost of building these homes. And I hope that was taken into account in how we budgeted that. And the other issue, the need in Ontario for housing is $4.4 billion to deal with the backlog of housing, and also the infrastructure that's required to support housing, like the subdivision, the roads, electrification, the water and sewer systems, the streets, all that kind of stuff. The base is all part of that 4.4 billion. So I just want to know, what kind of help can we receive from your government, if you form the government, to deal with that $4.4 billion urgent need. There is a direct relationship between mental health and the lack of housing. And that's driving a lot of mental health. There's overcrowding. There's a lot of overcrowding everywhere. This is one of the main issues that are raised continually with the Chiefs Committee on Housing and Infrastructure, which I chair. And the other thing that's in crisis is the need for long-term care. There are 38 to 40,000 people now on wait lists for long-term care. I want to know, what is your government's commitment for long-term care in general, and specifically providing First Nations with an opportunity to build the facilities that they require? How will you partner with how will you meet that need?
Thank you, Chief Miracle. Deputy Grand Chief Jim Bob.
Miigwech, Matthew. I'll let Chief Kelly LaRocca go ahead of me, please.
Sure. Chief LaRocca.
Miigwech, Chief. Hello, Andrea.
That's good.
It's to you. I'll try and keep it brief. I just really wanted to know what is your position on whether and how the province should go about relinquishing its monopoly on gaming, and what is your vision for economic reconciliation with First Nations as well. I'll throw in there, what would be your strategy concerning ministerial zoning orders and the need to consult and accommodate First Nations on those, or before those come to play. And then lastly, what would be your strategy to clean Lake Ontario and in fact, the Great Lakes in general? Miigwech.
Thank you, Chief. Deputy Grand Chief Jim Bob.
Miigwech, thanks for attending with us, Andrea. I was chief of Alderville First Nation for 17 years, so this has been an issue I have brought forward along with the Williams Treaty First Nations, but it's the toll on the 407 for First Nations. We've been fighting we should be exempt from any toll coming across our territories, not just for the Williams Treaty or the Inishtabik Nation, for all First Nation members of Ontario. And 6 years ago, we hosted a lobby day with all three parties. And again, yourself, you agreed that the First Nation should be told. At the time, it was Patrick Brown. He agreed, and the new leader now, he was a minister for the Liberal. He told us, "Well, take another route." That was kind of an insult to the First Nations people of Ontario. Some minister telling us to take another route against their own territory. So, I'd just like to know your position on the toll for exemption for First Nations. I know Premier Ford has exempted everyone, all Ontarians, from the 412 and 418, but he just didn't go far enough with the First Nations full exemption. So,
thank you. Horwath.
So, there's a lot of big stuff here. Let me see how I can get something meaningful on the table in terms of the $4.4 billion, Chief Miracle, and the 22,000 housing, as well as further commitment in terms of the housing on reserve and fixing that housing on territories. Then there. On the money part, I'll have my team get back to you with any details that we have. Our platform is costed, but I don't have it in front of me, and I don't have the specific details on that. And just the other thing that folks should know is that although we do have broad numbers on everything, and we do have a fiscal kind of or at least a plan for what these pieces are going to cost, what we don't have is the budget. And so the financial forecasting, the things that the finance department puts together for every government that gives us a sense of where the province is fiscally right now, that stuff is coming tomorrow with the what the government, I think, is calling a budget, but which we all know is really a platform because we're into an election immediately. So our kind of bigger picture fiscal plan will be available in the next little while, as soon as we can put our plan to the existing fiscal situation that exists. But I'm glad you raised the issue of long-term care, because I've visited many communities, and this comes up often, the need for long-term care on the communities, like on the actual territories. And the other thing that so yes, we will absolutely work with you to ensure that we're building that that infrastructure to care for your elders, because it's just so extremely important. The other thing that we've identified is the lack of home care as well. So providing resources and access to home care to help support people in their homes longer. And I know in some territories, the housing crisis, as has been described a couple of times now, is terrible in terms of overcrowding and all of those pieces. And we're certainly committed to doing what we can do and what you want in terms of dealing with that as well. So it's the shape of the condition of housing, as we all know. It's the overcrowding of housing, as we all know. It's the lack of long-term care, it's infrastructure for supporting elders, as well as the community care, if you will. And so all of those things are things that we are quite well aware of, and look forward to finding the solutions, which will be a little bit different in every territory, but have to be led by you and your community. On the gaming piece, I have to say, Chief LaRocca, what did you lay on? You laid on me the gaming piece, economic activity, cleaning the lakes, all extremely important pieces. It is interesting, and I haven't. I'm going to be frank. I haven't in the last couple of years, and I'm serious about this. Maybe 2 years or so. Been keeping on top of what's been happening with, particularly the Great Lakes, because you may know that there's a committee, a cross-border committee between the U.S. and Ontario, and others are involved in it as well. Some of the states on the other side of the border, dealing with the shape of our Great Lakes, and it's something that is extremely troubling. That the focus on those pieces on the water doesn't seem to be there so much anymore. And that's why we put, and I mentioned it earlier, we did put some emphasis on a complete water strategy for the province. And so I would hope that, and I wouldn't hope that, when we're elected in several weeks' time, we'll be engaging with you on these important pieces. The economic piece, absolutely, it's something I think I mentioned in my remarks, but it's also the issue around, for example, we in our platform we talk about mining taxes, for example, mining revenues should be going to First Nations communities and not just to the provincial treasury, but also making sure that the infrastructure that is built to create economic opportunity is built completely with you as a partner at the table, not only for the infrastructure, talking about roadways and those kinds of things, but also for the actual economic projects themselves, whether it be a mine or whether it be a battery plant, as was talked about earlier. On the tolls, Chief Jimbo, this is I think something that we need to spend some time on and get a good sense of where all of the inequities that you're identifying, not just you, but some of the other chiefs this morning as well, that need to be addressed. And so whether that's the municipal taxes, whether that's the tolls, whether that's the other pieces that we talked about earlier on when it comes to taxation of contractors on the contractors that are working in communities. These are all things that I think we need to sit down and have a serious plan on, one that's not me sitting down with a bunch of people from the finance department, because we all know how that's going to work out, but rather that we have the conversation and we come up with a roadmap forward, and then we go forward with the implementation.
Thank you, Ms. Horwath. There was just the ministerial orders. I think.
MZOs. Oh, yes, that was a really important one. That's the one thing I didn't jot down, so I didn't see it to remind me. But yes, the ministerial zoning orders have been an abuse of power by this government, and they're unacceptable. And so we are going to be combing through those ministerial zoning orders, and unless there's something that's really positive and that's got all of the pieces of community engagement that it should have, we will not be supporting those ministerial zoning orders that Doug Ford has rammed through to help out his buddies. But we will be engaging with communities to have the discussions about. So I'm going to give you one quick example. I'm from Hamilton, as most of you already know. Our city council asked for a ministerial zoning order because we have a seniors housing complex, an old seniors housing complex that's social housing, right? Affordable, like social housing. And the main floor was a little mall with little stores and things, but there have been no stores in that little mall at the bottom level of this building for decades. And so for some reason, there was a real challenge to get through the process to have those units that are commercial converted into residential. And so our city asked for a ministerial zoning order to expedite that process during the pandemic so that those units could be used to house people. That is something I wouldn't overturn because it's something that was, done within an existing envelope with complete support from the municipality, wasn't encroaching on anybody else's rights or lands. And so that's something, for example, that I wouldn't overturn. But the vast majority of the ones that have been signed by this government, we all know, are not like that. Quite the opposite. They're damaging to environment. They're damaging to relationships, and they're an unacceptable abuse of power.
I want to thank you, Ms. Horwath, for joining us today. The one question I ask of all the leaders who are joining us is that obviously there's a continuation of this conversation. Some ability for the chiefs individually or even through the Chiefs of Ontario to contact yourself or your team. There's some still questions on the chat that I see we don't have time to get to, but I guess it's the idea of, can that happen, and is there a process for that to happen as we move forward?
So I would say yes, and we would work with you to come up with the process. That would be the respectful thing to do.
Perfect. Thank you very much for joining us. So do take care of yourselves and give well in Minowa. And you can watch the rest of the leaders on YouTube. That's for watching. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. And thank you all so much for your thoughtful questions and conversation. Miigwech.
Take care.
Take care.
All right. Well, we're joined by Stephen Del Duca. Also, Mr. Del Duca. My name is Matthew Schreiner. I'm kind of facilitating the conversation as best I can, but everyone has tons of questions for the leaders as they join us. I'll give you probably, as much time as you need to give out your platform at time, and we'll go to probably around close to noon if you're able to stick with that time. And then we'll, so I'll leave the floor to you for some opening comments, and then I'll open the floor to Chiefs. And I just want to remind everyone, we do have till probably around noon, maybe as long as Mr. Del Duca can stick around with us. So welcome, Stephen, to our conversation. The floor is all yours.
Terrific. Miigwech for inviting me to join you today and for taking time to speak with me. I'm very much looking forward to the conversation. This is a huge honor, just as it was an honor for me many months ago to have a conversation with Regional Chief Glenn Hare. And I want to begin by acknowledging that I am on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And it is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. This acknowledgement is one that I know you've heard now for several years, since our previous Liberal government became the first in Canada to do so. But I want you to know that it carries enormous weight for me, because I am so very aware of and so very thankful for all that these lands have done for me and my family. So I add to this acknowledgement a pledge to you to do all that I can to give back in greater measure all that I've been given. And that begins with a commitment that an Ontario Liberal government would restore the standalone Ministry of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation. And we would do that as a first and necessary step to rebuilding a relationship that has been broken under the Ford Conservatives. Now, to that end, I want to thank you for putting together Creating a New Legacy, which is a roadmap to how to get the Crown and First Nations back on track and working together, and such a compelling and important call to action for this upcoming provincial election. Now, I've had the chance to read it, and will speak to many of its themes in my remarks today. And as I said a second ago, I'm also looking forward to your questions afterwards. I want to start by saying that the priorities you identify are, of course, not new, and that provincial governments of all political stripes have not done as much as we should have or could have to address your priorities. I think you know this. Too often, political leaders make commitments during campaigns that are forgotten in government. And while most people feel let down by the promises of their elected leaders from time to time, for no one is that more true. And for no one are those hurts as profound and as historic than when it comes to our First Nations. So let us talk instead about principles, because in your compelling call to action, that's where you begin. The first thing that you say in your document is this, words that I found to be very, very powerful. To create a new legacy, the relationship between First Nations and the Crown must be guided by principles of self-determination, reciprocity, and mutual recognition of nationhood. And in the very next section, you go on to say that consultation with First Nations is a duty, not a checkbox. These are such important principles that describe the foundational understanding that must be in place so that First Nations and the Crown can respectfully coexist and mutually benefit on the land and in community. I want you to know that I couldn't agree more. Yes, Ontario has made some progress in terms of taking a more consultative approach, and thanks to your leadership, many organizations and leaders across Canada and around the world now often include land acknowledgements, as I did today. But we all know there is a difference between doing those things because you feel you must, or for the sake of optics, and doing them because you believe they are necessary, which, I will be honest with you here, is my primary problem with the Ford Conservatives. who either choose to do things for the sake of optics, like buck a beer or those gas pump stickers, or claiming, as you know, that they'd be willing to jump onto a bulldozer to build a road to Northern Ontario without consulting First Nations, or choose to follow the lead of the latest poll repeatedly as they did during COVID, or worse still, make the wrong choices entirely, as they've done by proposing to build a new highway above Toronto. They call it the 413, a highway that will cost Ontario taxpayers $10 billion, save a few thousand drivers only 30 seconds, and pave over and destroy important wetlands and valuable farmland forever. I want you to know an Ontario Liberal government would make vastly different choices because we start with vastly different principles. When it comes to First Nations, my principles are set out in the treaties and their meanings that First Nations entered into with governments, as well as in the 94 recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Report and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. These are foundational to me personally and would be for my government also. Specifically, an Ontario Liberal government will strengthen revenue sharing agreements. We will make sure that Ontario children learn about the painful history of Canada's residential schools and the significant contributions of Indigenous peoples in all Ontario schools. And in an Indigenous-focused education, we'll support the teaching of First Nations languages and culture, as well as invest in First Nations public libraries. An Ontario Liberal government under my leadership will investigate and commemorate former residential school sites, as well as be the first Ontario government to make the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation a statutory holiday. We'll promote Indigenous community health and well-being, and we'll work with the federal government to ensure access to safe, clean drinking water, ending the need for boil water advisories, while at the same time working to restore rivers, wetlands, and watersheds. And finally, and I say this as a former Minister of Economic Development and Growth, we'll invest $10 million in Indigenous small businesses and support larger business through Indigenous infrastructure and energy projects. You have my commitment that an Ontario Liberal government will work with you to advance these and other priorities of your communities out of duty and out of principle. Now, one of the other things, the important principles that I've been speaking about a lot lately has been this concept of dignity. Now, I've been talking, for example, about the dignity of workers, specifically about our plans to support Ontario workers with a regionally adjusted living wage. You know, I say often, we're never going to have maximum economic dignity if we're always talking about minimums, if we always permit our workers and their families to be stuck in that never-ending race to the bottom. I talk about how we have to make sure that gig economy workers have portable benefits. And I just want to explain what that means. Portable benefits meaning that those workplace benefits, be it for prescription medication, for dental care, for parental leave, for mental health care, a real path to retirement dignity, that those benefits and the package that they come in are not attached to the working situation or the employment situation, but are instead attached to the worker themselves, staying with the worker for life, for their entire career, giving them real support and a real floor that they can stand on firmly. I talk a lot about small business and how we have to support small businesses, particularly ones hit hard during COVID, and to give new resources and breaks to startups and innovators. This will also help with the ongoing work of rebuilding First Nations economies and helping to make sure that First Nation businesses and entrepreneurs have the capital they need to succeed. All of these measures, every single one of them, are designed to support the dignity of a day's work. And by calling for economic dignity for workers, what I'm really saying is that workers are worthy of respect for their efforts. They are worthy of care for their future and of honor for what they do. But the principle of dignity doesn't just apply to workers. it must also apply to those whose working days are behind them and who we too often overlook. I'm talking, of course, about our elders, a group that First Nations peoples treat with great respect. Now, I happen to believe that when you've given your entire life to your family, you should be able to retire and live in dignity. And it falls to the people who are working right now to make sure that that happens, not only so that our parents and grandparents can live well, although that's very important, but also so that the system that we build together is ready for us when it's our turn, or for our kids or grandkids when it's their turn. And you know this, that hasn't been happening. We have a bad habit in our governments of not looking far enough into the future and undervaluing our elders. Ontario Liberals will change that. An Ontario Liberal government would choose to revolutionize the way that we take care of our elders to make sure that they can live at home for life. To do this, we're going to invest in home care, community-based home care, like no government in Canada ever has. We'll make sure that all seniors get the professional help and the support they need to stay in their own homes, including care like help taking a shower or cooking a meal, taking their medication, or even having a friendly face to have a chat with. We're not only going to end for-profit long-term care, we're going to change long-term care as we know it, as both the for-profit long-term care sector and the model as a whole has badly failed our seniors, as we saw so clearly during this pandemic. Here's what I mean by that. Our government will build actual homes for seniors, not glorified warehouses for the elderly, but honest to goodness homes that have personal support workers, nurses, and other specialists on site 24/7. And we're going to work with you to build First Nations long-term care homes according to this model, as well as develop a distinct housing strategy for off-reserve Indigenous peoples, including my commitment to funding the building of 22,000 new homes for Indigenous families. We'll choose to put the interests of our parents and grandparents ahead of the financial interests of the current for-profit long-term care system. That's a choice, again, that we will make out of principle. And the other choices that we would make are also vastly different from the status quo. The Ford Conservatives always choose. They always choose development over green space and corporate donors over climate. We would choose to support electric vehicle infrastructure everywhere in Ontario. We choose to stop overriding local land use decisions through MZOs, ministers' zoning orders, that they've been abusing, and take meaningful action on climate change. They chose to ignore the opioid crisis. We would choose to support the resources all communities, including First Nations, need to deal with this ongoing tragedy. As I said earlier, they would choose to build that highway, the 413. We instead would choose to end that project once and for all, and instead invest those billions of dollars back into our crumbling and neglected schools so that all of Ontario's kids in every corner of our province have a real chance at a great future. And above all else, where this government has chosen to let people fend for themselves, whether that's older people desperately trying to live safely in their homes as long as possible, or young people trapped in low-paying gig economy jobs, we choose to make sure that people live, work, and retire with dignity. Every single one of these choices, every single one of them is an act of respect, an act of caring, and a way to ensure that the next generation, for First Nations kids and my kids, and one day for my grandkids and yours, to inherit a stronger economy, a healthy environment, and a kinder, more caring world. My bedrock belief is that I believe in expanding opportunity at all times for all Ontarians. This is what we will accomplish. And I believe that we cannot move forward as a province until we have understood that respect for First Nations is a duty, not a checkbox. Because it will only be by committing to working in partnership that governments, including the Government of Ontario and First Nations, can build together the new legacy that we need. I'm very proud to be working closely with Vanessa Lalonde, a member of the Oneida Nation of the Thames, and our candidate, the Ontario Liberal candidate, running in the riding of London West, as we work towards reconciliation together. In a few weeks, I know you know this, in just a few weeks, we'll be headed to the polls, a choice between two parties with vastly differing ideas about how to lead our province. And now, after 4 years of a government that's made every conceivable bad choice, well, now it's your choice. And I believe Ontarians will choose to elect a government that supports workers and elders, that takes the climate crisis and our responsibility to our kids seriously, a government that will work with First Nations and others to build what we need to succeed, a government that will always put everyday people first, one that will look forward, always looking forward with determination and optimism and hope. I want us to build an Ontario that works as hard as Ontarians work. I want us to build an Ontario that cares as much as Ontarians care. And I am so looking forward to working with you to build that Ontario together. Thank you, Miigwech.
Mr. Del Duca. I'll start a conversation with our chief, so I'll go to Chief Kate.
Thank you for joining us today, sir. First of all, I want to talk about, you mentioned reconciliation, and that's been a word that's been circulating amongst political circles for some time now. I honestly do not see true reconciliation taking place, whether it be the federal government or the provincial government.
Mm-hmm.
One of the key things you talked about was revenue sharing. And again, I'm sort of ambivalent about the use of that term, because my concern is that there is a treaty annuity litigation case that's going on right now. My understanding is that the province is willing to negotiate that court case into some form of agreement. The concern I have, though, is the, and I think it was mentioned previously by one of the previous speakers to some degree, is the issue of division of powers. And my concern is Section 92, Section 109, dealing with lands and resources. You're a lawyer by trade, and you obviously know what I'm talking about if you studied constitutional law. And I'm not sure if you studied Aboriginal law while you're in law school, but there are two legal fictions that I feel that has to be repudiated by whatever government that's in power in Ontario and also in Canada. One is the doctrine of discovery, and I'm not sure if you understand what the doctrine of discovery is, and I'm not going to give you a history lesson here.
Okay.
You could find out for yourself, but it's an old doctrine that dates back to the time of the discovery of the Americas, in which various crowns in Europe laid claim to indigenous lands, and that's been called for repudiation of that for some time, and I think it's long overdue. Hopefully, with the papal visit this summer, that there is some movement to repudiate those old doctrines and the old papal bulls that basically deemed our people as non-humans. The second one is the assertion of crown sovereignty and the underlying title of the crown, and the that's two doctrines I find that we're constantly facing as First Nations people when we're asserting our rights to the lands and territory. There is this misnomer, and I call it a bunch of baloney, because that's exactly what they are, the doctrine of discovery and the assertion of crown sovereignty. But often crown lawyers would argue that every time a First Nation would advance their rights, whether they're trying to assert their rights and titles to the land, they come upon these two arguments made by, whether it be the federal crown or the provincial crown, on the assertion of crown sovereignty and the underlying title of the crown. Those two notions have to be truly examined. And what is the legal foundation for that? Like, there's nothing in international law that supports those two notions. And would your government, if you came to power, look at those legal assertions and again, or notions, and I call them baloney, for lack of a better word, because that's exactly what they are.
Right.
What would your government do to look at that legal framework from an international perspective in relation to Crown Aboriginal relations? Miigwech, thank you.
Yeah, well, thanks very much for raising that. It is true. I am a graduate of Osgoode Hall Law School. I wasn't familiar. I don't mind admitting that on this call. I wasn't familiar with both of those doctrines in the detail that you provided right now, and I do appreciate you talking with me and with us about that. I think the commitment that I'd be happy to make is to take the opportunity to educate myself more about exactly what you're talking about. And but I would just say, as I listen to you discuss this, and I know that you've called it a bunch of baloney, and I get that. I think it's important. I think it's important for governments, and the government that I lead, or the government that I hope to lead, to come at this entire conversation from a different perspective. So whether or not that will require, and I'm talking about mechanics now, legal mechanics, whether that requires an outright kind of disavowal of both of those doctrines, I'm not personally aware of the mechanisms behind how that would actually take place. But I'm not saying it can't take place. I'm just saying I don't personally know how that would happen, and I'd have to learn a little bit more about that. But I do think it's important for the default position, if I can put it that way, of the provincial government here in Ontario to not start off with that adversarial, the automatic is no, and then we're going to reverse engineer all of the reasons and excuses for why we want it to be a no. I just don't think we're ever, to your initial point, I don't think we're ever going to achieve a real, genuine reconciliation. I don't think that we're going to provide Ontario's First Nations or the First Nation Indigenous peoples living here with the real tools to help advance, again, reconciliation, to be full and equitable partners in what we're trying to build together, when that adversarial default always no position is just where the Crown starts.
Thank you, Mr. De Luca.
And I think that's, I think my experience. Sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and I think, from my experience in cabinet, though I didn't deal directly with this particular issue and the doctrines that you were mentioning, I think that it's an easy trap for the Crown or for the provincial government to fall into. Well, this is how it's always been done, so therefore this is how we're always going to approach it. You can't say that on the one hand and say that you reasonably want to achieve reconciliation by doing it the broken way, if you know what I mean. So I guess I'll finish up quickly here by saying I'm open-minded and frankly open-hearted about the conversation that you've raised with me, and I think we should have it. And we should have it as soon as we possibly can. And you have my commitment that we will.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I was going to ask Chief LaRocque, because I didn't see her hand, but here she is, Chief LaRocque.
Hello.
Hi there.
I just have a few questions. I think, firstly, I think you noted a commitment of $10 million to Indigenous small business.
Yes.
What are the criteria for qualifying as an Indigenous small business, and how many of them are actually in operation in Ontario?
So, we would want, let me just take one quick step back. I think one of the challenges that we've had, we've all had in this space for far too long, is people like me, governments led by people like me, basically saying, here are the criteria, here's this, here's that. I don't think that that's actually going to make sure that the $10 million or where that might go to, how that might grow over time, to make sure that it's targeted in the most effective way possible. It's my way of saying I would want to establish the criteria to make sure that it's effective with you, with First Nations, and to get that guidance and feedback, as opposed to pretending that I can dictate that or that we could dictate that from on high. I think, again, that, that previous way of approaching these kinds of programs by provincial governments is one of the real symbols of the dysfunctional relationship that's existed for far too long. So I'd want advice, I'd want feedback about how to make sure that it provides the support, that $10 million and the other funding supports that we envision actually hit the target, in a good way, and make the growth of those businesses and those entrepreneurs' dreams and aspirations become real.
My next question is, I'd love your position on economic reconciliation and what that means to you, and whether and how the province should relinquish its monopoly on gaming.
So, I'll talk a little bit about, again, my experience from my time mostly as the Minister of Transportation, a little bit less so at economic development and growth, because, to be frank, I was only in that second portfolio for about 6 months, but I had about 3.5 years at transportation. And I often found it, I'll say, troubling that in the case of a provincial government, the one that I served in, that we were quite quite keen to invest untold billions of dollars in various forms, again, in my case, transportation infrastructure, whether it was public transit or it was roads, highways, bridges, and other ministries, whether energy or health or, a series of other portfolios, education, post-secondary, multi-billions of dollars, just like the current government is, saying they're doing right now. And what always struck me as bizarre and counterproductive and even backwards was that we would go out across Ontario and we would make this investment, your money, my money, and we would never have a plan in place to make sure that we were leaving behind not just the physical legacy of the road, the bridge, the transit, the hospital, the courthouse, whatever it was, but that we were never prepared to think about how we would leave an economic development legacy in the different parts of the province where we were making these investments. We did talk a little bit about community benefits when I was Minister of Transportation for one particular transit project in Toronto, but I never understood why we didn't significantly broaden that concept of community or regional benefits so that when Project X or Company Y was done building whatever piece of physical infrastructure we were determined to build, so that there wasn't an opportunity for First Nations businesses to bid on the projects, whether the whole project or or particular aspects of the project, to help support capacity building so companies could be started, could grow, could scale up so that they would be able to qualify for the procurement opportunities. So these are just some of the examples that I believe that this, will never happen kind of organically. I think governments have to be deliberate and purposeful as they're structuring procurements. And I'm just using this as an example, as they're structuring their procurements so that the doors are open wide, so that the support is there, so that when we're done, I'm just use a highway as one example, when we're done building a highway, assuming that we've done all of our other work correctly, when we're done building the highway, it's not just that linear piece of infrastructure that's done, but we've left First Nations individuals have managed to access direct employment, indirect employment, but most importantly, now have the opportunity to say to governments and the private sector, okay, we now have the capacity to go and build and to bid and to win contracts and have the growth kind of spiral from there. So this is something that I have been talking about since I was Minister of Transportation. I will admit here, it disappointingly, it wasn't in my time at Transportation even really a concept that was being thought of, historically within that one ministry. And so I think in having someone like me who takes this very, very seriously as Premier, I think it's about the sort of full force and effect of a Premier's office. And as I said in my remarks today, right at the beginning, and a standalone, singularly responsible Minister for Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation at the table to say to the other ministers in all of those line ministries, this is the vision, and this is how we get to where we need to be. So that's I guess a personal example of how I feel about one of the ways that we could help achieve economic reconciliation.
So I don't hear gaming as being part of that.
I take your point on that. You didn't hear it specifically because, again, I would want to have a longer conversation about what's taking place in gaming. But I'd want to have that conversation again as partners, as opposed to dictating from on high and telling you how it needs to be. I'd want to make sure that we are using the opportunity through what we have already in place in gaming and what we might have in the future to make sure that when I talk about that economic development legacy, that it's real for First Nations.
Has your position changed from when you were Minister of Transportation to allow for 407 exemptions for your treaty partners?
Again, I'm open to having that conversation. I can remember when it was first raised with me.
I wasn't open before.
Well, I distinctly remember the conversation. I remember where I was in the province when the conversation was brought up. And yeah, I'm open to that discussion as well.
I only have two quick questions. I'll just shoot them out there and then move on. Ministerial zoning orders. I'd love to hear whether you believe First Nations consultation and accommodation should be addressed first and prior to the issuance of any MZO. And as well, I just wondered what your party's strategy is to clean and remediate Lake Ontario and the rest of the Great Lakes. Miigwech.
Thanks so much. I will say on the Minister of Zoning orders, first of all, I mean, you know this already, but let's be completely clear. The past 2 years in particular, that mechanism, which was always supposed to be a tool of last resort for governments, has been really used as a weapon of first instance by the Ford Conservatives for their own very narrow and political agenda. And I think it's actually quite horrible to watch how they've abused that power. A number of months ago, I did make a commitment that if elected, Ontario Liberals would actually scrap the MZO power. We would get rid of it. We would replace it with a much narrower power or mechanism that would give the minister, again, narrower scope to deal with only very specific kinds of projects like not-for-profit long-term care, true affordable or social deeply affordable housing, projects of significance to the province, as one example. But we've also included in that commitment a requirement to do the kind of consultation that the current government has refused to do. And yes, as part of that, right at the beginning, the idea of making sure that the consultation and the accommodation is done with our First Nation partners is something that would be part of how we would go forward to design a much narrower power. And by the way, unlike the current MZO power, our new power would also be subject to judicial review, which was taken away from the MZO power a couple of years ago or a number of years ago. So I think that's a better way to plan. I think it's a better way to build out communities that are sustainable and walkable and good for everybody for whom those communities, as they're built, will impact. With respect to the Great Lakes, in our platform, which we haven't released specifically or in its totality just yet, but we will in a few days, you're going to see a very strong component dealing with creating a strong and healthy environment, including protection for our Great Lakes and investments that will be required to be made in order to achieve that. I said this in some remarks a couple of weeks ago. We don't believe as a party that currently our watersheds, our rivers, our lakes, that they are properly protected. I think they're an afterthought for the current government. And I think that's got to change. So just my way of saying, stay tuned for that component part of our platform that will be out in the next few days, actually.
Sir, Chief Michelle. Chief, are you? Oh, there you go.
Bonjour, I'm Chief Provincial from Victor Schnabek. Thanks for coming and answering our questions. Victor has 3 run-of-the-river water power projects, and those water power projects provide substantial amount of own source revenue that's badly needed because of the underfunding by the federal government. The province's MRP, the Market Renewal Plan, puts that revenue at risk and puts those projects, in particular those water run-of-the-river water projects, at risk. So I would just like to know what your thoughts are on the province's Market Renewal Plan. My thoughts are is that they don't know what they're doing.
Thanks very much for that question. I appreciate your candor in terms of how you've described the program itself. Look, here's what I would say about the Market Renewal Program, and frankly, a lot of the other topics that I know are of keen interest to all of you and to First Nations here in Ontario. I think when you make a commitment the way that I have around appointing once again a standalone minister with a real ministry behind her or him that's properly resourced, the weight of a premier and a premier's office behind it to make sure that we are completely rethinking how we engage in program design, whether it's this new MZO or the replaced MZO power, or it's the Market Renewal Program or economic development opportunities, or what's happening in gaming. I think it starts from that place of principle. How do you want to achieve the outcomes, and how are you designing the programs to make sure that the outcome is being achieved? So as I said in my remarks today, at a broad level, at a high level, the principle that really motivates me in terms of building a relationship and then strengthening the relationship with First Nations is to make sure that you're at the table as partners, that you don't just come to the table with that default no, just presuming it can't be done because it's never been done. So you're talking about the revenue sharing aspect of the market renewal program, or how what market renewal might want to do might, inhibit or limit the revenue opportunities that are there and are badly needed, as you pointed out. To me, that's an example of thinking within government that says, this is how it's always been done. And the implication is, this is how it's always been done. Therefore, it can't evolve, it can't grow or change or get better. And as a liberal, I will tell you, I don't think progress is supposed to end. I think we always need to be looking together as partners. We always need to be looking for a better way to do things. So, so you have my commitment that is the approach that a government that I would lead would take to all of the topics that we are talking about right now. I want to stress, because I think it's important to not overpromise and underdeliver, because I've had the chance to serve in government and I've seen, this better than I do, how slow the machinery of government can move sometimes. I don't want to stand here today and make a commitment that it's going to happen overnight. I mean, we're talking about decades, many, many decades of layers of outdated, backward, regressive decision-making by governments that have directly and negatively impacted First Nations. It will take time to unwind, redo, and start to build in a better way. But you do have my commitment starting on day one that I will be resolute in my pursuit of doing it better, because the status quo is completely unacceptable.
Yeah, but specifically on the market renewal plan, what's your thoughts on that? As I would suppose that you would have an inside, thoughts on what's going on in regards to the market renewal plan.
Yeah. So look, my approach on the market renewal program is that I think it is a well-intentioned concept. I think it's something that we have to be looking at in terms of where we want to go. But it sounds to me, from what you've said and from what I've heard from others, that, as we always say, the devil's in the details. And so, a well-intentioned concept around how we go forward and create the kind of system that we're looking for has clearly gotten lost in translation that is now impacting you in a negative way. And so that's something I would want to take a look at in a very serious way through that lens of how are we rebuilding the relationship and the partnership in a way where there are local, regional, and province-wide benefits for all First Nations. So, I think it's a good concept. I think it sounds to me like the way that it's being implemented is deeply problematic. And so therefore we should look at it.
All right.
Thank you.
Chief Collins.
Thank you, Matthew, and good morning, Stephen. My question is around economic reconciliation, as Chief LaRocque just mentioned. A few years back, Premier Wynne wrote a procurement policy, but that procurement policy has been pretty weak and really not adhered to in the province of Ontario. And I think the way it needs to be drafted is that there needs to be set-aside opportunities for our contractors on major bills. Great. That is being announced by the province day in and day out, that run through a lot of our communities, a lot of our territorial lands, and we're not written in a way that our contractors can take advantage of the opportunities. Well, if you become the Premier of Ontario, will you rewrite the procurement policy that creates set-aside opportunities for our contractors within our territorial lands? So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. I mean, I almost never give short answers to questions, but I'm going to give a short one here. Yes, an emphatic yes. This is exactly what I was referring to just a couple of minutes ago when I was talking about the economic development and economic opportunity legacy that needs to be realized through the multi-billions of dollars worth of government procurements that are taking place in your territorial lands, but frankly, everywhere across the province. I would actually go a step further, and I would tell you, as someone who has been advocating and fighting for procurement transformation for quite some time, that this is where we need to go and how we need to make sure that we are looking at it through a completely new lens. So you talked about the set-asides. I've talked about community benefits in the past, and we've done that on some of our transit projects. For example, we need to actually make that grow and be real, but it also requires, I'm going to tell you this right now, it's perfectly fine to rewrite the procurement rules, but until the ministries, the people who work in the ministries, the cabinet itself, the premier and the premier's office, until there is a very clear mandate or message delivered about having to change, what's going to happen is it's going to get lost in the paperwork. It's going to get lost in the bureaucracy. And then you and I will be talking in 4 years and you will say, well, Del Duca, you rewrote the rules, but you never really gave them life. They never really became real. So to me, yes, it's important to restructure and transform the procurement, dealing with set-asides and everything else that you've talked about. But then it requires rolling up our sleeves and a premier putting literally his or her shoulder to the wheel and saying, now it's going to happen, and it's going to happen or else. And that's what I'm committed to doing.
Yeah, and saying that though, that's the same discussion I had with Premier Wynne when she did announce the procurement policy. I mean, there's so much bureaucratic red tape that our folks have to get through because, and when we live in First Nation land, they consider us not bondable because a bonding company can't come onto our land to take our assets or anything like that. So there has to be a different process. There has to be a way that really opens the doors for our members to be a part of the industry, be part of the bill. I know that the province spends billions of dollars in infrastructure every year.
Yes.
But we don't get nothing out of it other than some kind of wording that says you have to consult or you must consult. Well, that's bullshit, and that's days gone by. I mean, it has to be written so that the contractors or the major contractors that are bidding on these projects, here's a set-aside opportunity, and here's the dollar amount that needs to be set aside for First Nation contractors and First Nation people across the territories.
Yeah, I will go. I'll mention one other thing that can be done, and I'd be quite delighted to do, proud to do. I would include it in my minister's mandate letters, not just the Minister of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation, but every single line minister. We would put it into especially the ministers that have direct responsibility for infrastructure builds, like MTO, like energy, like health, like education, post-secondary. I mean, all of them, to actually require that the machinery of government kind of wake up and do it the right way, instead of as you put it, the way that it's you put it rather colorfully, the way that it's been done up until now. So we're on the same page, and I agree wholeheartedly.
For all your children out there, it was poop. Thank you, Chief. Chief Kopanets. Oh, Chief, you might be muted. There you go.
Hello, this is Chief Vernon Kopanes.
Hi there.
Bonjour, Neno Kasendigo, I take no them. Let me ask you, me. Me watching dinner, Goigagi, get to see me now, Negagi, packing out. Marvin don't you buy, or was Kandagan, or Shaggy me engaging cut. Wetish Quebeca, Gananda was Nishna. Me Maun Gian, or we cannot come in this discussion. Wetish Gani Mago Dani. Danny should debauch him. Go with go. Good morning, everybody. And I'd like to thank the elder that opened this morning, and also the all the speakers and the ones that are going to run. I've been listening to all the comments this morning, and all were very good comments. And I guess my question would be to and also to mention to the Liberal government with my first one is the nuclear waste management that I don't know who did in the past, came up with all this waste. I know we weren't part of it. Now they want us to be a part of it because they came up with this waste. And it seems that this type of way of getting us involved in certain things here is not what our treaty is all about. We're supposed to be listening to you guys after what we would like to happen. And you keep coming back saying you want to legislate this and that. I don't think it's in my interest or in my people of my community's interest to have anything legislated. Everything's already there for us in our treaty. Also, our treaty is with the crown, with the queen, and I know there's been letters going out from other chiefs to the queen, and her reply is, "We have somebody to look after you there in the country called Canada." And I don't see that's not working with our community and what we want to do. And also the province. The province doesn't hold title to land, nor does Canada. The reason why I say that, if you have you heard about the treaty meeting they had in Geneva? Canada was being asked if they have a receipt to hold all the resources in Canada, and they haven't yet produced one.
Right.
Can you find that out? If there is a receipt, and I know the prior Stephen Harper couldn't provide anything, and I see that Trudeau couldn't provide anything. I think it should start there, really. If we need to talk about this, we can. But as far as the province telling us we got to implement policies, etc., on what? On what basis? So that's my my statement to that, and my question, I guess, is mainly towards the nuclear waste management. You know, when you plan to do something, like you say, you implement a plan. I think you mentioned that in one of your statements regarding the renewal program there, the market renewal program. Well, this wasn't very carefully thought of.
Yeah.
And now you want to include us in your decision making. And I don't think that's you know, I don't think that's a very appropriate way of trying to negotiate in our way. You did something, you guys deal with it. Wouldn't involve us. No. You made a mistake, you deal with it. And you know, also with these dams, you know, your way of trying to find out powers of to keep the light systems happening for the country of Canada. There are other ways. You're talking about the green, you know, there are other ways. What is it? The big companies are telling you guys what to do? There are other ways of means of preserving the grandmother here.
Right.
Is everybody afraid to change? I think that's where it lies. You know, look at the North Pole, what's happening?
Yeah.
We're doing something about it. What about you guys? You know? And I think with our treaty, we really do have to renegotiate. We really have to talk about that. Otherwise, I think the chiefs are going to be fed up, and they're going to meet together and have a look at this in a different manner. I'm sorry, I feel I have to speak frank, but I also have an issue with our, you know, our J treaty. I have relatives on the state side here. That's not being, you know, That's not being respected by our people here in Treaty 3. When you talk about the healthcare system, we're supposed to be at the top of the chain here according to our treaty. I don't think all that funding that you guys identified shouldn't be administered over there at the health level. It should be administered at our communities. When we talk about the reserves across Canada that make up that percentage, well, you're forgetting about the treaty territories on the Crown lands as well that we have access to. We shouldn't have to be buying land. There's no need to buy land. That was what was interpreted to my elder that passed on. We just had a handshake. We didn't surrender.
Right. Hey, Chief,
And
did you
if you're going to work with us, then work with us. That's what I ask. Miigwech.
Thank you, Chief. I see one more question after this one, Mr. DeLuca, and then Chief Miracle.
Thank you.
Tego, Mr. DeLuca, Adorotario, Royaner, Ronatayoni. I'm Chief Don Miracle from the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte, a large First Nation, and my clan is Wolf. I'm the elected chief. I would like some clarity on the 22,000 houses. How many are on reserve and how have you costed them out? What's in your budgetary platform to pay for that? And how many are going to be built on the reserve is one question. And the other thing is the commitment to long-term care. I co-chaired the Chiefs Committee on Long-Term Care with Sharon Lee Smith, who was the Deputy Minister at that time under the Wynne government. And we had studies done, and First Nations have a lot of comorbidity and frailty at a much younger age. And I'll tell you a story. We had a veteran who served in both the First and Second World War, Marvel Bernhardt. His daughter, who she cared for her parents, when she needed long-term care, what there was a 38,000 people on a wait list, over 4,000 people on a wait list for the Southeast Lands, which serves our community. Her daughter had to work, so she and make sure that her mother, who had dementia, didn't get out of the house. She did get out of the house while her daughter slept one night and froze to death. And so there are people that do need long-term care and supervision. The other thing that's challenging a lot of people is the allowances for under ODSP and Ontario Works is $731 a month under OW, and $1,100 a month is not going to enable them to pay rent anywhere. I mean, that doesn't cover a month's rent now anywhere in today's prices, and then to have food and to pay electricity and maybe transportation and their healthcare needs. So there's an income deficiency, and there's the housing is a crisis. Long term is a crisis. Safe drinking water is a crisis. Many First Nations do not have service lots even to build houses on. They need the infrastructure to, like the water, the sewer, the street lights, the road. The need in Ontario to get caught up is $4.4 billion, according to a national study that was done by the partnership with the Indigenous Services Canada and the AFN. Ontario's portion of that was $4.4 billion. The federal government is going to put some money in to build houses, but it's totally insufficient. So that's why I'd like to find out, with the 22,000 houses you mentioned, how many are designated for reserve, and what's the total budget in your platform to pay for that, and what's your commitment to build the long-term care facilities, the licensed long-term care facilities.
Well, thanks very much for all of the issues that you just raised. They're all so very, very important to me and to our party, and of course to you. So I will confirm that 22,000 units, if I can put it that way, that we're talking about for Indigenous, to support Indigenous people, would be off reserve. Just so we know, 22,000 over a decade off reserve. The full costing of our platform will be included when we reveal or release our platform in just a few days. There will be a very large and bold component part of that that will deal with housing, all forms of housing. But our plan is fully costed, and we will release those details when the platform is released. On long-term care, I know in my remarks a little bit earlier, I talked about how we need to rethink and deliver a completely different model in long-term care. And I believe that we do. So I know I talked a little bit about the home care first approach. I didn't give a lot of details in my opening remarks, but I will now just quickly. So what I envision around home care first, this home care guarantee that I'm determined to deliver, is that over 4 years, our government would invest $4.4 billion. That's 4.4 billion new dollars, which will help 400,000 additional seniors access community-based home care. I think that's there's about 700,000 seniors in Ontario today who use home care. So this is a quite substantial increase in the number of seniors who are able to get the kind of home care they need in a system that's easy to navigate and easy to use. You make a really good point. Not every single senior, despite our best efforts and despite that $4.4 billion investment, will be able to rely only on home care. You're right about that. There will always be some seniors who need a level of care that cannot be provided at home, in their home. I think the difference between how the current government and how we in Ontario for too many years have looked at long-term care, we have largely warehoused or institutionalized our seniors in large groups. We have not properly funded the system, and we've allowed the for-profit aspect of long-term care to focus far more on shareholder dividends rather than on the care that our elders deserve to have, our parents and grandparents deserve to have. So in our plan, over a 6-year period, by 2028, we will end for-profit long-term care in this province. But at the same time, we've made a commitment to build and rehabilitate 58,000 long-term care spaces. Here's the big difference. I don't want those 58,000 spaces to be in warehouses or big box institutions. I want us to actually do what they do in other parts of the world. And for those, I'll call them long-term care homes, to actually look like homes. So instead of multiple stories and hundreds of seniors packed together, where it's really hard to deal with infection prevention and control, where people with various levels of need, cognitive and physical need, are kind of all together at the same time, I don't think that's a healthy way. I don't think that's a safe way or a dignified way for our elders to live out what are supposed to be their golden years. So we envision a far more decentralized system where those 58,000 spaces are out in the community. It could be a series of homes, like literally dwellings that are in the same neighborhood on the same street. They would have personal support workers, they would have nurses, they would be there on site 24/7, but it would be 6 or 7 or 8 or 4 seniors living together rather than 100 or 200 or 300. So between the 58,000 new spaces and rehabilitated spaces, the 400,000 additional seniors who would be able to access community-based home care, and the additional 15,000 assisted living spaces that we would create, I believe we'd be able to meet the demand that we have right now, but we would meet that demand in a far better way for our elders. So they could be safe, so they could be healthy. I want us to prioritize home care, but for those who need that additional level of care, I want them to be in a physical surrounding that supports their mental health, it supports their physical health, and it gives them the dignity that I believe they've earned. So again, on the 22,000, stay tuned for exactly what our costing is for that when the platform comes out. But I just wanted to do a slightly longer explanation around our elder care plan.
Okay, Mr. DeLuca, so then I guess the First Nations have put a lot of work into designing and building a long-term care facility. For example, we have approval to build 128-bed single rooms, much similar to the ones that operates at Oneida. Single rooms to control infection for people who need 24-hour care, and home care does not provide 24-hour care.
Yeah, so I listen, let me be clear. I have no objection to long-term care. I have an objection to institutionalizing our seniors. Okay. I think it's a model, and I'm not talking about your specific project. I'm talking about as a model across the board. In my home community of Vaughan, there are literally dozens of long-term care homes. I'm not personally familiar with your particular project, so please don't take this as a slight against that project. I'm sure it's fantastic. But when you think about the roughly 110,000 seniors who live in long-term care right now across this province, and what we saw during this pandemic, what those facilities looked like, and the concept behind them, that we are, again, putting large groups of seniors into one confined space, whether it's 2 stories or 4 stories or 10 stories. I just think there's a better way. Now, that doesn't mean that we will do anything that will disadvantage a senior, First Nations or otherwise, a senior in the short term. This is a large, cumbersome, complex system that we have to reorient. It will take time. And at the end of the day, the thing that's most important to me is that the seniors we have who have the needs get the needs delivered to them in the right way. So there will be a transitional period. There's no doubt about that. But when you and I are talking in 10 years, for example, I want us to be able to look at a home care, long-term care, and elder care ecosystem that we built in this province that's second to none in the world, not in Canada, in the world. And I think we have the capacity to do that working in partnership. And I would want First Nations to be an essential and guiding partner to make sure that we are delivering that in the right way.
Yeah, just to give you some idea on the figures, the nursing assessments that are done to decide what is the best way to care for the senior based on their health requirements. It indicates that there are 38,000 to 40,000 people that need long-term care, like intensive long-term care. In the Southeast Lands, for our area, the wait list is 4,091. First Nations only have 225 of 78,000 beds.
That's not enough.
Which is 1/4 of 1%.
Yeah.
So it's been so the ability, and a lot of them want to live within the dignity of their own community. They're on their reserve where their family, their friends can come and visit them. Seniors who live alone often don't have a lot of company, and so they face not only the mental health of just loneliness. And so, the homemakers come in for a few hours, they see them, but the socialization that's not part of healthcare is very lacking in many seniors. And so they live out their final years in a lot of in a very lonely state alone in their home.
Yeah, listen, so again, I agree. Let me just stress again that while I understand some seniors don't want to be isolated and living alone, and that's not an ideal situation, I think there's a solution that is better for our seniors between those two extremes. So between someone who's living alone and is isolated and someone who is stuck living with 100 or 200 or 300 other seniors. So perhaps the senior that you're describing who's living alone and is isolated would be better off living in a long-term care home that looks like a 2,000 square foot bungalow somewhere in Bay of Quinte, and is living there with 5 other seniors or 4 other seniors and a full-time PSW and a nurse, and has the support, but has a porch, has a backyard, has a garden. And they're in that smaller setting that actually feels like the home that they used to live in. So again, it accomplishes the same thing in terms of how many spaces, because I don't talk about beds, I talk about spaces. I think it's too easy for politicians to talk about beds and pat themselves on the back. I talk about spaces because I think that's what we should want to create for our parents and grandparents. So living in a setting that feels and looks more like a home rather than a warehouse is how I'd want to be treated, and how I'd want to treat my parents who are still alive and living in their 80s. If they were no longer able to live in their home, I'd want them to be in a surrounding that felt good to them. And so that's what we're trying to achieve with our plan. But I will stress, we're not planning to do it alone. There will be a transition period, and I am determined to make sure that with your expertise and others in First Nations, that we do make sure we hit the right outcomes for all seniors, including First Nation seniors, in a way that works for First Nation seniors, not for the government at Queen's Park, but for First Nation seniors.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just a couple of things. Just Mr. Chief Kopanis was talking a little bit about that nuclear waste. I just want to make sure we acknowledge his question and give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about that. And also, Chief Miracle was talking. There's a big, huge deficit on reserve in terms of housing. I guess, do you see a role for the province in terms of assisting with the servicing, maybe up to the, I guess I'm not exactly sure, but there must be a role there for the province to try and assist First Nations to overcome that deficit.
Yeah, so very much open to the conversation about provincial support for servicing for on reserve. Again, very open to that conversation in partnership with our federal government, of course, and municipal and regional governments as well. On the issue of the nuclear waste, I know as I was listening to what was shared with us today, I think it goes right to the heart of how First Nations have been treated as the afterthought, as opposed to the partner from the very beginning. So a lot of very, I think, compelling points were raised in what was shared. And I think about our energy policies that I'd want to pursue as Premier. I think there's no one easy solution to where we want to go to keep our environment clean and safe, especially in the fight against the climate crisis and reducing our reliance on fossil fuels. But I think conservation first, renewable energy, the new technologies that we have out there. I mean, I think there are a variety of options available on the energy side specifically. But again, I think there was a larger issue that was being touched upon, which has been the issue of not being part of the discussion in a respectful and genuine way from the get-go, but being the afterthought, the checkbox, as you referred to in your report, in your action plan, and you're 100% right about that. So there needs to be a fundamental reorientation of the relationship and the partnership, and that is something I'm keen to pursue with you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Delahousse.
Thank you
for joining us. I just want to have one last question, and I know that in a press time frame, we don't have the opportunity to have a larger conversation. So I always ask each of the leaders who joined us: is there an opportunity to continue this conversation with yourself and your team, both perhaps through the Chiefs of Ontario or even with individual chiefs across Ontario? So I asked that question, and I'll say thank you very much for joining us.
Well, first of all, it's been my honor to join you. And I will say it's not only that there's a possibility of the conversation continuing, I am convinced there is a requirement and an obligation from my perspective for this conversation to continue, for the relationship to grow and be nurtured. And I know I have an obligation, and the Ontario Liberals that I lead have an obligation to do our part, and you can count on us.
Thank you, Mr. Delahousse.
Thank you
for joining us. Thank you very much. That brings us to the end of our session. Unfortunately, Mr. Ford wasn't able to join us because he had tooth surgery. But I do want to give an opportunity for the regional chief for some closing comments. And we'll go to Sally to close our session. At that point, we'll be, I guess I'll open the floor, see if there's any other conversations before we go to the elder. So, regional chief.
Oh, miigwech Matthew. Miigwech Gimak for quite to make to the chiefs for asking the questions and taking the time today to ask the questions to the candidates. I want to say miigwech to all the candidates that come before us this morning. So just in closing real quick, I repeat myself as a chief of my community in the Strawberry Nation and Ontario Regional Chief right now to all the candidates. Number one, as you all know, we're studied out. So let's not forget that. We're studied out. We know what we want. And if you want to know, look on the shelves. New ministers on any new governments today coming to play, please do not send them to us and only to be told I need to be educated. Let's get off from the starting gate right from the get-go. Because if we have to teach them, we're going to lose a year and then some, and nothing will be accomplished. Mental health, it's a pandemic. It's a pandemic in our communities. We've been screaming. I know there'll never be enough, but it is a severe, it's taking lives. Far too often when we bury someone, Minister, all the candidates, that's when government comes to us, what can we do? We don't want you then. It's too late. Those are harsh realities for us. Housing, you mentioned a whole bunch of housing and dollars. There's a few things I think that need to be scratched when we talk about those. And one is the deadline. Don't give us a deadline when you give us funding for our housing of March 31st and force us to do construction in the winter. Let us enjoy the construction season for cost-related issues and everything. Give us that opportunity to make our community strong like that. And Trespassing Act needs to be revisited. Let's not revisit when there's another tragedy. I believe the Trespass Act flies against our face, literally, as we heard in the Western provinces already. And last, should you form anyone new form government or even the present? I know, I think it's a long shot. I believe it's a long shot for any of us to ever run and then be successful as a minister. But I do know you as leaders have elected, you can appoint a deputy First Nation voice into your circle. Put a First Nation voice in cabinet to work with you. We need to have that. The government has to stop telling us how to live in our communities, because I know a lot of ministers, new ones that come on board, don't even know where Manitoulin Island is, let alone KI and all them up the north. So we all need that to go put together. We need a voice with the government on these decision-making projects and whatever we need to have. Water is a big one. As you heard, Lake Ontario's been outstanding for years. So let's do something. Let's do something, and 3 years' time, our work like this again will just sail right along, real nice. So again, Matthew, miigwech, and to the chiefs and to everyone, I want to say miigwech, and again to our elder who will lead us off to the next sessions for today. Miigwech.
Thank you, Regional Chief. I do want to open up. I see Chief Miracle has a comment, and I'll also open up.
I just wondered, did Mr. Ford propose any other dates if he's got his tooth surgery to have this conversation with the chief, so that all the candidates, so that chiefs can hear what these candidates have to say? And I guess, and if the other leaders of the other parties want to listen in, they'd be welcome to do that as well.
Chris?
Hi, Chief Miracle. So there was some discussion. They said that we might look to other dates. We're considering possibly May 18th, which is the day after the Leadership Council meeting, which is on the 17th. But we're still in very early stages. We were only notified yesterday that he won't be attending.
Okay, maybe he could take the initiative to propose some dates to us, and I guess whoever's available would join in and just copy the other leaders, the other parties in on it too, and just make it so they can have a chance to hear what he has to say. I'm sure quite a few chiefs would sign in to hear what he has to say.
Yep, we'll work to set that up.
Okay, thank you.
Any other comments for the chiefs before I ask Sally to close our session? We get to go have lunch. I do want to thank everyone for their patience. I know there was lots of questions, lots of issues that everyone has, and we did have a limited amount of time, so I want to thank everyone for their participation. It was quite easy when I don't have to ask any questions at all. And hopefully I was able to manage it well, so at least we got some perspectives from 3 different parties during the session. So I want to say miigwech for everyone for participating, and we'll definitely see you again soon. And I'll go to Sally to close our session. Sally.
Thank you, Creator, for helping us today. Thank you for helping us think about the concerns and issues of our communities, and for being able to share some of our hopes and dreams for the coming years. Thank you for looking after our communities and families, particularly during this time of the pandemic, and generally the transformation that's happening all over the world during this climate change period. As ever, we put our lives in your hands, Creator, and ask that you help us to get along better, not only with each other, but with the plants, the animals, the trees, the insects, and the earth. That is important to reconnect during this time of transformation to make a better way for all of us. Chimiigwech Shemnido. Chimiigwech, Chimiigwech, Chimiigwech. Nahal.
Miigwech Elder Shigongay.
Howdy, right, Sally.
Yeah,
everyone.
I want to give